Imagine lying in a cold, damp hut, the smell of mildew clinging to the air, your stomach growling so loud it drowns out the howling wind outside. It's not just hunger. It's the kind of ache that feels like it's carving you hollow. You're a medieval peasant, and this is your life. Not a fairy tale with knights and castles, but a gritty, exhausting grind where every day is a fight to survive. Welcome to my YouTube video, Boring History for Sleep, Why Medieval Peasant Life Sucked. I'm diving into the raw, unfiltered reality of what it was like to be an ordinary person in the Middle Ages. No glamour, no glory, just the truth. This isn't your typical history lesson with dates and battles. It's a story about people like you and me, stuck in a world that seemed designed to break them. So, settle in, maybe grab a blanket, because this tale might make you feel a little chilly. Let's step into the mud-caked boots of a peasant named Edric and see why his life was anything but romantic. Edric woke up before dawn, like always, his breath visible in the freezing air of his family's one-room hovel. The straw mattress he shared with his wife, Elfwin, and their 2 kids was lumpy and smelled faintly of mold. He didn't complain. There was no point. Complaining didn't fill bellies or keep the Lord's bailiff from banging on the door, demanding rent. Edric was 28, but his hands were already gnarled like an old man's from years of plowing fields and hauling firewood. His back ached constantly, and his teeth hurt when he chewed the gritty bread that was their main meal. Elfwin wasn't much better off. She spent her days grinding grain by hand, tending a tiny garden, and praying the harvest wouldn't fail again. Their kids, little Wulfric and Edith, were skinny, always coughing, their faces smudged with dirt. This was normal. This was life for most people in medieval England, where survival wasn't guaranteed and hope was a luxury few could afford. Let's paint the picture. It's the year 1320, somewhere in the muddy fields of Norfolk. The sky is gray, the kind of gray that feels like it's pressing down on you. Edric's village is a cluster of wattle and daub huts, their walls patched with whatever scraps the peasants could scavenge. The air smells of wood smoke, manure, and desperation. Everyone knows everyone, not because it's cozy, but because there's nowhere else to go. The church looms at the edge of the village, its stone walls a reminder of God's judgment, and the priest's sermons about how suffering is just part of the deal. Beyond the village, the Lord's manor sits like a vulture, watching. Edric and his neighbors owe everything to the Lord, their land, their crops, even their time. If you're thinking this sounds like slavery with extra steps, you're not far off. Serfdom meant you were tied to the land, and the land wasn't yours. Edric's day starts with a prayer, not out of piety, but because he's terrified. What if the crops fail? What if the Lord raises the rent again? What if the plague that took half the village last year comes back? Fear is a constant companion, like the lice crawling in his tunic. He heads to the fields, his wooden plow creaking as he drags it through the heavy soil. It's backbreaking work, and the harvest isn't even his to keep. Most of it goes to the Lord, some to the church, and whatever's left might feed his family through winter. Elfwin's no stranger to this struggle either. She's up before Edric, milking the cow they share with 3 other families, hoping it doesn't dry up. She's heard stories of villages where famine hit so hard people ate grass. She shudders, glancing at her kids, who are already out gathering sticks for the fire. They're too young to understand how fragile their world is. Here's the kicker. Edric's not lazy. He works harder than most people today could imagine. But no matter how hard he tries, the system is rigged. The Lord could demand more grain, more labor, more anything, and Edric has no say. If he complains, the bailiff might seize his only ox, or worse, throw him in the stocks for disobedience. Elfwin knows this too, but she's got her own battles. The priest keeps hinting she's not devout enough because she missed church to tend a sick child. The other women in the village whisper about her, their jealousy and boredom twisting into gossip. And then there's the Reeve, the Lord's right-hand man, who's been eyeing her a little too closely. She doesn't tell Edric she can't. He's already on edge, and one wrong move could cost them everything. Let's zoom out for a second. This isn't just Edric and Elfwin's story. It's the story of millions of peasants across medieval Europe, people whose names never made it into history books. They were the backbone of the Middle Ages, growing the food, building the castles, paying for the wars they never chose. But their lives were a cycle of toil, hunger, and fear. Disease was a constant threat. Smallpox, dysentery, or the dreaded Black Death could wipe out whole families. Taxes were crushing, and the church took its cut too, promising salvation while demanding tithes. The weather could make or break you. A bad harvest meant starvation, and a good one just meant the Lord took more. Even justice was a joke. If Edric got into a dispute with a freeman or, God forbid, someone connected to the Lord, he'd lose before he even opened his mouth. Now, don't get me wrong, there were moments of light. Edric and Elfwin had each other, and that counted for something. On rare evenings, when the work was done and the kids were asleep, they'd sit by the fire, sharing a cracked bowl of pottage and maybe even a laugh. The village had its festivals, too. Harvest feasts or saints' days where people danced, drank watery ale, and forgot their troubles for a night. But those moments were fleeting, like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. Most days, life was a grind, and the grind was merciless. Edric's biggest fear wasn't death. It was losing what little he had. His family, his home, his dignity. And lately, things are getting worse. Rumors were spreading through the village, carried on the lips of peddlers and pilgrims. The Lord was in debt, they said, and he was squeezing the peasants harder to pay it off. Edric overheard the reeve talking about a new tax, one that could force him to give up his last sack of grain. Elfwin heard something else, something about the Lord's son, a cruel boy who liked to hunt in the village and not for deer. The kids weren't safe either. Little Wulfric had been caught stealing an apple from the Lord's orchard last week, and the bailiff let him off with a warning. Next time, he might not be so lucky. The tension was building, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Edric could feel it in his bones, a sense that something was about to break. Last night, Edric couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, his mind racing. Elfwin stirred beside him, whispering about a dream she'd had. A wolf circling the village, its eyes glowing red. Superstition, maybe, but in a world where omens felt as real as the mud under your feet, it was enough to make Edric's heart pound. He didn't believe in wolves with red eyes, but he knew danger was close. The Lord's men had been riding through the village more often, their faces hard, their hands on their swords. The reeve had been asking questions, poking into who owed what, who'd been slacking. And then there was the stranger who'd passed through yesterday, a man with a scarred face and a story about a rebellion in a neighboring village. The peasants there had refused to pay the Lord's tax. They burned a barn. And now, the Lord's knights were coming. Edric didn't know what to do. He wasn't a hero, just a man trying to keep his family alive. But the whispers of rebellion were tempting, like a spark in dry straw. Could he stand up to the Lord? Could he risk everything, his home, his wife, his kids, for a chance at something better? Or was it safer to keep his head down, to endure, to survive? Elfwin's eyes met his in the dark, and he saw the same question there. They didn't speak, but the silence was heavy with unspoken words. The village was a powder keg, and Edric could feel the fuse burning closer. What would he do when it reached him? Would he fight, or would he break? That's where we'll leave Edric for now, standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything, or end it. His story isn't just about one man. It's about a world where survival was a daily battle, where hope was a flicker in the dark. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the brutal realities of medieval peasant life, the hunger, the disease, the backbreaking labor, and the rare moments of joy that kept people going. We'll see what happens when the Lord's men come knocking, and whether Edric finds the courage to stand his ground or crumbles under the weight of a system built to keep him down. So, stick around, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep exploring this forgotten world together. For now, close your eyes, let the story sink in, and maybe dream of a life where the odds aren't stacked against you. Good night. Show in sidebar, imagine lying in a cold, damp hut, the smell of mildew clinging to the air, your stomach growling so loud it drowns out the howling wind outside. It's not just hunger, It's the kind of ache that feels like it's carving you hollow. You're a medieval peasant, and this is your life. Not a fairy tale with knights and castles, but a gritty, exhausting grind where every day is a fight to survive. Welcome to my YouTube video, Boring History for Sleep, Why Medieval Peasant Life Sucked. I'm diving into the raw, unfiltered reality of what it was like to be an ordinary person in the Middle Ages. No glamour, no glory, just the truth. This isn't your typical history lesson with dates and battles. It's a story about people like you and me, stuck in a world that seemed designed to break them. So, settle in, maybe grab a blanket, because this tale might make you feel a little chilly. Let's step into the mud-caked boots of a peasant named Edric and see why his life was anything but romantic. Edric woke up before dawn, like always, his breath visible in the freezing air of his family's one-room hovel. The straw mattress he shared with his wife, Elfwin, and their 2 kids was lumpy and smelled faintly of mold. He didn't complain. There was no point. Complaining didn't fill bellies or keep the Lord's bailiff from banging on the door, demanding rent. Edric was 28, but his hands were already gnarled like an old man's from years of plowing fields and hauling firewood. His back ached constantly, and his teeth hurt when he chewed the gritty bread that was their main meal. Elfwin wasn't much better off. She spent her days grinding grain by hand, tending a tiny garden, and praying the harvest wouldn't fail again. Their kids, little Wulfric and Edith, were skinny, always coughing, their faces smudged with dirt. This was normal. This was life for most people in medieval England, where survival wasn't guaranteed and hope was a luxury few could afford. Let's paint the picture. It's the year 1320, somewhere in the muddy fields of Norfolk. The sky is gray, the kind of gray that feels like it's pressing down on you. Edric's village is a cluster of wattle and daub huts, their walls patched with whatever scraps the peasants could scavenge. The air smells of wood smoke, manure, and desperation. Everyone knows everyone, not because it's cozy, but because there's nowhere else to go. The church looms at the edge of the village, its stone walls a reminder of God's judgment, and the priest's sermons about how suffering is just part of the deal. Beyond the village, the Lord's manor sits like a vulture, watching. Edric and his neighbors owe everything to the Lord, their land, their crops, even their time. If you're thinking this sounds like slavery with extra steps, you're not far off. Serfdom meant you were tied to the land, and the land wasn't yours. Edric's day starts with a prayer, not out of piety, but because he's terrified. What if the crops fail? What if the Lord raises the rent again? What if the plague that took half the village last year comes back? Fear is a constant companion, like the lice crawling in his tunic. He heads to the fields, his wooden plow creaking as he drags it through the heavy soil. It's backbreaking work, and the harvest isn't even his to keep. Most of it goes to the Lord, some to the church, and whatever's left might feed his family through winter. Elfwin's no stranger to this struggle either. She's up before Edric, milking the cow they share with 3 other families, hoping it doesn't dry up. She's heard stories of villages where famine hit so hard people ate grass. She shudders, glancing at her kids, who are already out gathering sticks for the fire. They're too young to understand how fragile their world is. Here's the kicker. Edric's not lazy. He works harder than most people today could imagine. But no matter how hard he tries, the system is rigged. The Lord could demand more grain, more labor, more anything, and Edric has no say. If he complains, the bailiff might seize his only ox, or worse, throw him in the stocks for disobedience. Elfwin knows this too, but she's got her own battles. The priest keeps hinting she's not devout enough because she missed church to tend a sick child. The other women in the village whisper about her, their jealousy and boredom twisting into gossip. And then there's the Reeve, the Lord's right-hand man, who's been eyeing her a little too closely. She doesn't tell Edric she can't. He's already on edge, and one wrong move could cost him everything. Let's zoom out for a second. This isn't just Edric and Elfwin's story. It's the story of millions of peasants across medieval Europe, people whose names never made it into history books. They were the backbone of the Middle Ages, growing the food, building the castles, paying for the wars they never chose. But their lives were a cycle of toil, hunger, and fear. Disease was a constant threat. Smallpox, dysentery, or the dreaded Black Death could wipe out whole families. Taxes were crushing, and the church took its cut too, promising salvation while demanding tithes. The weather could make or break you. A bad harvest meant starvation, and a good one just meant the Lord took more. Even justice was a joke. If Edric got into a dispute with a freeman or, God forbid, someone connected to the Lord, he'd lose before he even opened his mouth. Now, don't get me wrong, there were moments of light. Edric and Elfwin had each other, and that counted for something. On rare evenings, when the work was done and the kids were asleep, they'd sit by the fire, sharing a cracked bowl of pottage and maybe even a laugh. The village had its festivals, too. Harvest feasts or saints' days where people danced, drank watery ale, and forgot their troubles for a night. But those moments were fleeting, like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. Most days, life was a grind, and the grind was merciless. Edric's biggest fear wasn't death. It was losing what little he had. His family, his home, his dignity. And lately, things are getting worse. Rumors were spreading through the village, carried on the lips of peddlers and pilgrims. The Lord was in debt, they said, and he was squeezing the peasants harder to pay it off. Edric overheard the reeve talking about a new tax, one that could force him to give up his last sack of grain. Elfwin heard something else, something about the Lord's son, a cruel boy who liked to hunt in the village and not for deer. The kids weren't safe either. Little Wulfric had been caught stealing an apple from the Lord's orchard last week, and the bailiff let him off with a warning. Next time, he might not be so lucky. The tension was building, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Edric could feel it in his bones, a sense that something was about to break. Last night, Edric couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, his mind racing. Elfwin stirred beside him, whispering about a dream she'd had. A wolf circling the village, its eyes glowing red. Superstition, maybe, but in a world where omens felt as real as the mud under your feet, it was enough to make Edric's heart pound. He didn't believe in wolves with red eyes, but he knew danger was close. The Lord's men had been riding through the village more often, their faces hard, their hands on their swords. The reeve had been asking questions, poking into who owed what, who'd been slacking. And then there was the stranger who'd passed through yesterday, a man with a scarred face and a story about a rebellion in a neighboring village. The peasants there had refused to pay the Lord's tax. They'd burn a barn, and now the Lord's knights were coming. Edric didn't know what to do. He wasn't a hero, just a man trying to keep his family alive. But the whispers of rebellion were tempting, like a spark in dry straw. Could he stand up to the Lord? Could he risk everything, his home, his wife, his kids, for a chance at something better? Or was it safer to keep his head down, to endure to survive? Elfwin's eyes met his in the dark, and he saw the same question there. They didn't speak, but the silence was heavy with unspoken words. The village was a powder keg, and Edric could feel the fuse burning closer. What would he do when it reached him? Would he fight, or would he break? That's where we'll leave Edric for now, standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything, or end it. His story isn't just about one man. It's about a world where survival was a daily battle, where hope was a flicker in the dark. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the brutal realities of medieval peasant life, the hunger, the disease, the backbreaking labor, and the rare moments of joy that kept people going. We'll see what happens when the Lord's men come knocking, and whether Edric finds the courage to stand his ground or crumbles under the weight of a system built to keep him down. So, stick around, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep exploring this forgotten world together. For now, close your eyes, let the story sink in, and maybe dream of a life where the odds aren't stacked against you. Good night. Edric stood at the edge of the field, his hands gripping the rough handle of his plow, staring at the horizon where the Lord's manor crouched like a predator. The morning mist clung to the ground, curling around his boots, and the air carried a sharp bite that promised another cold day. He hadn't slept much, not after Elfwin's whispered dream about the red-eyed wolf. Her words clung to him like damp wool, heavy and unsettling. He wasn't one for omens, but the village felt wrong lately, like a pot about to boil over. The Reeves' visits were more frequent, his questions sharper, and the Lord's men rode through with a purpose Edric couldn't quite place. The stranger's talk of rebellion in the next village hadn't helped. A spark of hope? Maybe, but also a warning. Rebellion meant fire, blood, and consequences. Edric wasn't sure he was ready for that, but the thought of doing nothing gnawed at him just as fiercely. Elfwin was back at the hut, kneading dough with flour they could barely spare. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere. The Reeves' lingering stares had grown bolder, and yesterday he'd stopped by while Edric was in the fields, asking about their tithe to the church. She'd kept her answers short, her eyes on the ground, but his presence felt like a stone in her chest. She hadn't told Edric yet. He was already stretched thin, his temper fraying like an old rope. One wrong word, and he might confront the Reeve, and that would be the end of them. The Lord didn't tolerate defiance, and the Reeve was his eyes and ears. Elfwin glanced at Wulfric and Edith, who were outside, poking at the fire with sticks. They were too young to carry this weight, but they felt it anyway. Wulfric's sullen silence, Edith's nervous humming. Elfwin wanted to protect them, to promise them a better life, but promises were as scarce as good harvests. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. The other peasants went about their work, tending livestock, mending roofs, hauling water, but their eyes darted toward the road whenever hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Everyone had heard about the new tax. The Lord's debts were no secret, whispered about in alehouses and churchyards. He'd lost money in a failed venture, some said, or squandered it on feasts and tournaments. Either way, the burden fell on the peasants. Edric's neighbor, old Godric, had muttered about it last night, his voice low over a shared cup of thin ale. "They'll take our last grain," he'd said, his eyes sunken from years of toil. "And when we've nothing left, they'll take our blood." Godric was old enough to remember the famine of '09, when half the village starved. His stories were grim, but they weren't just stories, they were warnings. Edric tried to focus on the plow, but his mind kept drifting to the stranger. The man had lingered only a day, his scarred face and rough voice drawing curious glances. He'd spoken of the rebellion in hushed tones, saying the peasants there had driven off the Lord's men, burned a granary, and kept their harvest. It sounded impossible, like a tale told to children, but Edric couldn't shake it. He'd seen the spark in the eyes of the younger men in the village. Men like Cynric, who was barely 20 and already bitter from years of labor with nothing to show for it. Cynric had been at the alehouse last night, talking louder than he should, saying things like "we're not dogs and the Lord bleeds like we do." Edric had hushed him, glancing at the door, but the words stuck. They were dangerous, but they felt true. Elfwin, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own fears. The Reeve wasn't the only shadow hanging over her. The priest had been preaching about sin more than usual, his sermon sharp with warnings about disobedience. She'd overheard him talking to the bailiff about unruly women, and though her name wasn't spoken, she felt the weight of it. She wasn't unruly. She worked from dawn to dusk, kept her family fed, and paid her tithes when she could. But missing church to care for Edith's fever had earned her a lecture, and now the priest's eyes followed her like a hawk's. The village women weren't much kinder. They whispered about her, saying she thought herself above them because she could read a few words from the Bible. It wasn't true. She'd learned from her mother, who'd been a servant in a monastery before marrying a peasant. But truth didn't matter when tongues wagged. The kids felt the tension too, though they couldn't name it. Wulfric, at 8, was old enough to notice his parents' hushed arguments and the way his father's shoulders slumped after a day in the fields. He'd always been quiet, but now he was quieter, his eyes darting to the road whenever a stranger passed. Edith, only 6, clung to her mother more than usual, asking questions Elfwin couldn't answer. "Why's Papa so tired?" she'd asked yesterday, her small hands tugging at Elfwin's skirt. "Why's the Reeve always here?" Elfwin had forced a smile, saying something about grown-up worries, but her heart ached. She wanted to shield them, but the world didn't allow it. The Lord's son was another worry, a boy of 16 with a cruel streak, known for riding through villages and taking what he wanted. Elfwin had heard stories from other women, stories that made her keep Edith close. Back in the fields, Edric paused to wipe sweat from his brow, though the air was cold. He glanced at Cynric, working a nearby strip of land. The younger man's face was hard, his jaw set as he drove his plow into the earth. Edric knew that look, anger mixed with hopelessness. He'd felt it himself, though he tried to bury it. Cynric caught his eye and nodded, a small gesture, but it carried weight. They hadn't spoken about the stranger's words, but Edric knew they were both thinking about it. Rebellion was a dangerous dream, one that could burn everything down. But doing nothing felt like dying slowly. Edric's hands tightened on the plow. He thought of Elfwin, of Wulfric and Edith, of the Reeve's greedy eyes and the Lord's endless demands. Something had to give, but what? The day wore on, and the village's unease grew thicker. A peddler arrived at noon, his cart creaking under the weight of pots and cloth. He brought news. More villages were whispering of unrest, refusing taxes, hiding grain. The Lord's knights were cracking down, burning homes to make examples. Edric listened, his stomach twisting. Elfwin overheard too, her hands pausing over the dough. She thought of the wolf in her dream, its eyes glowing like embers. Was it a warning or something else? She didn't know, but the air felt heavier, like the moment before storm breaks. As the sun sank low, casting long shadows over the fields, Edric saw a rider on the hill, a knight, his armor glinting faintly. The man didn't approach, just watched, then turned and rode away. Edric's heart thudded. The fuse was burning shorter, and he still didn't know if he'd have the courage to act when it sparked. The knight's silhouette lingered in Edric's mind as he trudged home, the plow abandoned in the field. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a bruise-colored sky that matched the ache in his chest. The village was quiet, too quiet, as if every soul was holding their breath. He passed old Godric's hut, where the old man sat outside, whittling a stick with hands that trembled from age or fear. Godric's eyes met Edric's, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Saw the rider, did you?" Godric finally muttered, his voice rough as gravel. Edric nodded, his throat tight. "Means trouble," Godric said, spitting into the dirt. "Always does." Edric wanted to ask what he meant, but the weight of the day pressed down on him, and he kept walking. Trouble was already here. He could feel it in the air, thick as the smoke curling from the village chimneys. Inside the hut, Elfwin was stirring a pot of pottage over the fire, the smell of onions and barley barely masking the damp rot of the walls. Wulfric and Edith sat nearby, sharing a crust of bread, their small faces lit by the flickering flames. Elfwin glanced up as Edric entered, her eyes searching his for answers he didn't have. She hadn't told him about the Reeve's visit, and the secret sat like a stone in her gut. "You're late," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Edric grunted, dropping onto a stool. "Saw a knight on the hill," he said, his words heavy. Elfwin's spoon paused mid-stir, and Wulfric looked up, his eyes wide. "A knight?" the boy asked, his voice small but curious. Edric forced a smile. "Just watching, lad. Nothing to fret over." But the lie tasted bitter. Elfwin's gaze lingered on him, and he knew she wasn't fooled. Across the village, Cynric was pacing outside the alehouse, his breath visible in the cold night air. The stranger's words about rebellion had taken root, sprouting into something reckless and wild. He was tired of the Lord's taxes, the Reeve's sneers, the endless labor that left his hands blistered and his future empty. He wasn't like Edric, cautious and weighed down by family. Cynric had no wife, no kids, just a mother who coughed blood and a sister who died in the last famine. He had nothing to lose, and that made him dangerous. Earlier, he'd overheard two men whispering about hiding grain in the woods, away from the Lord's collectors. It was a bold move, one that could feed the village through winter or bring the Lord's wrath down on them all. Cynric wanted to join them, to do something, but he needed others. He thought of Edric, steady but hesitant. Could he convince him? Or would Edric's fear hold them all back? Elfwin, meanwhile, was grappling with a different kind of danger. The Reeves' visits weren't just about taxes anymore. His questions about their tithe had been a pretext, his eyes lingering too long on her face, her hands, the curve of her neck. She'd heard stories about him. Other women, other villages, whispered tales of favors demanded and punishments for refusal. She felt trapped, like a hare in a snare. Telling Edric would only spark a fight they couldn't win, but keeping silent was eating her alive. She glanced at Edith, who was humming softly, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Elfwin's heart ached. She'd do anything to keep her children safe, but the cost was growing steeper. The priest's sermons didn't help, his talk of sin and obedience making her feel like every choice was a trap. Was she a bad wife for hiding this? A bad mother for not running? The village's tension wasn't just personal. It was collective, woven into every conversation, every glance. At the church that morning, the priest had preached about loyalty to the Lord, his voice sharp as a blade. God sees all, he'd said, his eyes sweeping over the huddled peasants. And he punishes those who stray. Edric had shifted uncomfortably, wondering if the priest knew about the stranger's visit. Cynric had smirked, muttering under his breath about fat priests and starving children. Old Godric had stayed silent, but his face was grim. The church was supposed to be a refuge, but it felt like another chain. The tithe was due soon, and Edric's family barely had enough to eat, let alone give. Refusing wasn't an option, not unless they wanted the priest's wrath, or worse, the Lord's. Subplots were sprouting like weeds. There was Wulfric, who'd overheard Cynric's talk at the alehouse and was starting to ask questions. "Why's everyone so mad, Papa?" he'd asked that morning, his small face serious. Edric had brushed it off, but Wulfric was sharp, noticing things a boy his age shouldn't. He'd seen the Reeves' horse tied outside their hut, heard his mother's clipped answers. He didn't understand it all, but he felt the wrongness, and it scared him. Then there was Edith, who'd found a strange mark carved into a tree near the orchard, a crude circle with a slash through it. She'd shown it to Elfwin, who'd paled but said it was nothing. Elfwin knew better. She'd seen that mark before, years ago, when her father had whispered about men who defied the Lord and paid with their lives. Was it a sign of rebellion or a warning? The Lord's son added another layer of dread. He'd been seen riding near the village, his laughter carrying across the fields. The women whispered about him, their voices low and fearful. He was young, spoiled, and cruel, with a habit of taking what wasn't his: food, trinkets, sometimes worse. Elfwin kept Edith inside now, her heart pounding whenever hoofbeats sounded. Edric had noticed her fear but hadn't pressed her. He had enough worries, like the new tax and the night on the hill. The peddler's news about other villages, burned homes, executed rebels, kept him awake, his mind spinning. Was resistance worth it? Or was it suicide? He thought of Cynric's anger, Godric's warnings, Elfwin's silence. Everyone was pulling in different directions, but the danger was closing in. As night deepened, Edric sat by the fire, sharpening a knife that was more tool than weapon. Elfwin watched him, her hands twisting in her lap. She wanted to tell him about the reeve, the mark on the tree, her fears for their children, but the words wouldn't come. Outside, Cynric was meeting two men in the shadows of the alehouse, their voices low as they talked of hidden grain and secret plans. Old Godric sat alone, staring at the stars, remembering a time when he'd been young and foolish enough to dream of freedom. The knight's horse was stabled at the manor, but his eyes had marked the village, and his report would reach the Lord by dawn. The fuse was burning, and the spark was closer than anyone knew. Edric's knife glinted in the firelight, and he wondered if he'd have the strength to use it when the time came. The fire in Edric's hut burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. He sat hunched over, the knife still in his hands, its blade catching the faint glow. Elfwin was silent across from him, her hands no longer twisting, but still, too still, as if she were bracing for something to shatter. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, each too heavy to lift. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the flimsy door, and Edric's ears strained for other sounds. Hoofbeats, shouts, anything that might signal the storm breaking. The night on the hill had been a warning, and the village felt like it was teetering on a knife's edge. Cynric's whispers of rebellion, the Reeves' creeping menace, the Lord's son prowling like a wolf. It was all closing in, and Edric could feel the weight of it crushing his chest. He glanced at Wulfric and Edith, asleep on their straw mat, their small bodies curled against the cold. He wanted to protect them, but he didn't know how. Elfwin's silence was louder than the wind. She hadn't told Edric about the Reeves' latest visit, the one where he'd lingered too long, his hand brushing her arm as he spoke of favors that could ease their debts. Her skin still crawled at the memory, and shame burned in her throat for not speaking up. She'd seen the mark on the tree again today, that slashed circle carved deeper now, as if someone had returned to make it bold. It wasn't just a warning. It was a call, a sign that someone in the village was ready to act. But who? Cynric? The men he'd been whispering with? Or someone else, someone quieter, who'd been watching and waiting? Elfwin's eyes flicked to Edric, his face drawn and tired. She wanted to tell him everything, to share the burden, but fear stopped her. If he confronted the Reeve, it would end in blood, his, hers, or their children's. In the village, Cynric was moving through the shadows, his steps quick and purposeful. He'd met with the two men again, their faces hidden under hoods, their voices low as they spoke of the grain hidden in the woods. It wasn't much, a few sacks buried under leaves, but it was enough to keep the village alive if the Lord's collectors came. Cynric's blood was hot with the thrill of it, the idea of striking back, even in this small way. But he knew it wasn't enough. The stranger stories of rebellion had lit a fire in him, and he wanted more than stolen grain. He wanted the Lord to feel their anger, to know they weren't just dirt to be trodden on. He tried to talk to Edric earlier, catching him at the edge of the field, but Edric had been cagey, his eyes darting to the manor. Think of your kids, Cynric had pressed, his voice sharp. What kind of life is this for them? Edric hadn't answered, but Cynric saw the flicker in his eyes. Anger, fear, maybe both. Old Godric was awake too, sitting outside his hut despite the cold, his whittling knife idle in his lap. He'd seen too many winters, too many lords, too many broken men. The knight on the hill wasn't just a scout. He was a message, a reminder that the Lord's patience was thin. Godric remembered another time, decades ago, when a village had risen up. The men had been bold, their hearts full of fire, but the Lord's knights had come with steel and flame. The village was ashes now, its name forgotten. Godric had warned Edric, but he wasn't sure the younger man listened. Edric was steady, but steadiness could be a chain. Cynric, though, Godric saw the spark in him, the same spark he'd once had. It was dangerous, but it was alive. He looked up at the stars, wondering if he'd live to see what came of it. Wulfric stirred in his sleep, his small hand clutching the edge of the blanket. He'd heard more than he should, bits of Cynric's talk, his father's heavy sighs, his mother's whispered prayers. The Reeves' horse had been outside their hut again today, and Wulfric had seen the man's shadow through the door, heard his low voice. He didn't understand it all, but he knew it was wrong, like the time he'd been caught in the orchard and the bailiff's eyes had been cold as stone. Edith had told him about the mark on the tree, and he'd wanted to see it, but Elfwin had kept them inside, her voice sharp with fear. Wulfric didn't know what rebellion meant, but he felt it in the air, like the charge before a thunderstorm. He dreamed of knights, not the shining ones from stories, but dark figures with swords, riding through the village, their faces hidden. The Lord's son was another shadow, moving closer. He'd ridden through at dusk, his horse kicking up mud, his laughter sharp and cruel. The women had pulled their children inside, and even the men avoided his gaze. He'd stopped at the alehouse, demanding drink, and Cynric had watched him, his fists clenched. The boy was a spark in a dry field, reckless and dangerous. Elfwin had heard he'd taken a girl from a nearby village last month, and the whispers said she hadn't been seen since. The thought made her hold Edith tighter, her heart pounding. The priest's sermons about obedience felt like a cage, and the Reeves' threats were a lock. She wondered if the mark on the tree was a way out or a noose. Edric set the knife down, his hands shaking. He couldn't shake the image of a knight, the way he'd watched the village like a hawk circling prey. The peddler's stories of burned villages played in his mind, each one a warning of what happened when peasants forgot their place. But Cynric's words were there too, burning brighter. The Lord bleeds like we do. Edric looked at Elfwin, her face pale in the firelight, and felt a surge of anger. Not at her, but at the world that kept them chained. He wanted to ask her what she was hiding, why her eyes were so haunted, but the words stuck. Instead, he stood, the stool creaking, and stepped outside. The village was dark, but he saw movement near the alehouse, 3 figures slipping into the woods. Cynric? The grain hiders? He didn't know, but his pulse quickened. Elfwin followed him to the door, her breath catching. She saw the figures too, and her mind flashed to the mark on the tree. Was this it? The moment everything broke? She wanted to call Edric back, to beg him to stay safe, but her voice failed. Above them, the stars were hidden by clouds, and the wind carried the faint sound of hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. Edric's hand tightened on the doorframe, his eyes fixed on the road. The night was coming back, or someone worse. The village was a tinderbox, and the spark was here. He didn't know if he'd fight or flee, but the choice was rushing toward him, unstoppable. Edric's breath hung in the cold night air as he stood frozen at the door, his eyes locked on the dark road where the hoofbeats grew louder. The village was a patchwork of shadows, the alehouse barely visible through the mist, but the 3 figures he'd seen slipping into the woods lingered in his mind. Were they Cynric and his grain hiders, or someone else entirely? Elfwin's hand grazed his arm, her touch light but urgent, pulling him back to the moment. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the same fear that churned his gut. The hoofbeats were closer now, sharp and rhythmic, like a heartbeat racing toward doom. Edric's grip on the doorframe tightened, his knuckles white. He wanted to run, to grab Wulfric and Edith and flee into the night. But where could they go? The Lord's land stretched for miles, and serfs who ran were hunted like dogs. The tinderbox was sparking, and he was caught in the middle. Elfwin's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the wind. Edric, come inside. But he couldn't move. The hoofbeats stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then a shout cut through the night, not from the road, but from the direction of the church. Edric's head snapped toward it, his heart pounding. A glow flickered in the distance, faint but growing, like firelight spilling from the churchyard. Elfwin gasped, her hand clutching his arm now. What's that? She breathed, her voice trembling. Edric didn't answer. He didn't know. But the glow wasn't natural, not at this hour, and the shout had been raw, desperate. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud, torn between staying with his family and finding out what was happening. Elfwin pulled at him, but her strength was fading, her fear winning. Across the village, Cynric was deep in the woods, his breath ragged as he crouched beside the hidden grain sacks. The 2 men with him, Baldwin and Lef, both young and angry like him, were piling more leaves over the stash, their movements quick and nervous. The plan had been simple. Hide enough grain to survive the winter, defy the Lord's collectors, and maybe inspire others to do the same. But Cynric's heart was racing for a different reason. Baldwin had let slip something earlier, something that changed everything. The Reeve knows, Baldwin had whispered, his eyes darting to the trees. He's been watching us. Asked me pointed questions about the woods. Cynric's blood had gone cold. The Reeve wasn't just a leering tax collector. He was a snake, slithering between the Lord and the village, sniffing out defiance. If he knew about the grain, he could bring the Lord's knights down on them all. Cynric's hand rested on the knife at his belt, his mind spinning. They had to act, but how? Confront the Reeve? Move the grain? Or was it already too late? Back at the church, the glow was brighter now, and the shouts had multiplied. Men's voices, sharp with panic, and a woman's cry that pierced the night. Old Godric was on his feet, his whittling knife forgotten, hobbling toward the churchyard as fast as his creaking joints allowed. He'd seen fire before, in that long-ago rebellion, and the memory burned in his chest. As he neared, he saw figures running, their shapes blurred by the mist. The church door was open, and flames licked at the wooden frame, small but hungry. Godric's stomach dropped. The priest was there, his robes flapping as he shouted, his face twisted with rage or fear. Godric couldn't tell. Blasphemy, the priest roared, pointing at something or someone in the shadows. Godric squinted, his old eyes struggling, but he saw the mark, that slashed circle, painted in ash on the church wall. His heart thudded. This wasn't just rebellion. This was sacrilege, and the Lord would make them all pay. Edric was moving now, drawn toward the church despite Elfwin's pleas. "Stay here," he told her, his voice rough. "Keep the kids inside." She shook her head, tears in her eyes, but he was already gone, his boots pounding the muddy path. The village was waking, doors creaking open, faces peering out. The glow from the church was a beacon, pulling them all toward it like moths. Edric's mind raced. Was this Cynric's doing? The grain hiders? Or had the stranger with the scarred face come back, lighting a fire bigger than anyone could control? As he reached the churchyard, he saw the priest, the flames, the mark, and something else. A figure on horseback, not the knight from the hill, but the Lord's son, his face lit by the fire, his eyes gleaming with something darker than cruelty. Edric froze. The boy's presence wasn't a coincidence. He was here for a reason, and it wasn't a prey. Elfwin stood at the door, her hands trembling as she watched Edric disappear into the night. Wulfric was awake now, his small voice asking, "Where's Papa going?" She didn't answer, couldn't. Her eyes were on the glow, her mind on the Reeve's threats, the mark on the tree, the hoofbeats that had stopped too soon. She'd heard the woman's cry from the church, and it chilled her. Was it one of the village women? Someone caught in the fire? Or something worse? She thought of the Lord's son, his laughter in the fields, the stories of the girl who'd vanished. Her hand went to the knife on the table, the one Edric had been sharpening. She didn't want to use it, but the world was closing in, and she was done feeling helpless. Edith stirred, whimpering, and Elfwin pulled her close, whispering, "Hush, love. It's all right." But it wasn't. Nothing was all right. Cynric and his men were heading back to the village when they saw the glow. Baldwin cursed, his voice shaking. "That's the church," he said, his eyes wide. Cynric's heart sank. They hadn't planned this. The grain was one thing, but fire at the church was another. The priest would call it the devil's work, and the Lord would answer with swords. Lef grabbed Cynric's arm. "We need to run," he hissed. But Cynric shook him off, his jaw tight. Running meant leaving his mother, the village, everything. He thought of Edric, of the kids who'd starve if the Lord burned their homes. "We go back," he said, his voice hard. "We face it." Baldwin looked ready to bolt, but he followed, the three of them breaking into a run, their knives glinting in the moonlight. The church was burning, the Lord's son was there, and the Reeve was watching. The village was a trap, and they were all caught in it. Edric pushed through the crowd at the churchyard, his eyes on the Lord's son. The boy's horse snorted, its hooves pawing the ground, and his smile was a blade. The priest was still shouting, the flames spreading to the thatch above the church door. The mark on the wall seemed to pulse in the firelight, a taunt to God and man. Edric's breath caught as he saw Cynric emerge from the crowd, his face pale but set. Their eyes met, and Edric knew Cynric hadn't started this fire, but he was part of it now. The Lord's son laughed, a sound that cut through the chaos, and raised his hand. Behind him, more riders appeared, their armor clanking, their faces hidden by helms. The village was surrounded, and the spark had caught. Edric's hand went to his belt, where his knife should have been, but it was back in the hut. He was unarmed, exposed, and the world was about to break. The churchyard was a chaos of fire and shadows, the flames now clawing at the thatched roof, sending sparks into the night sky. Edric stood frozen, his heart hammering as the Lord's son sat high on his horse, his cruel smile cutting through the crowd. The riders behind him fanned out, their armor glinting like the edge of a blade, surrounding the villagers who'd gathered in a panicked huddle. The priest's shouts of blasphemy echoed, his finger jabbing at the ashen mark on the church wall, that slashed circle, now a beacon of defiance. Cynric stood at the edge of the crowd, his knife in hand, his eyes locked on the Lord's son. Edric could see the fire in him, the same fire he'd felt but never dared to let burn. The village was a tinderbox, and the spark had caught. Edric's hand twitched, aching for the knife he'd left behind, as the realization hit. This was it. The moment everything broke. Elfwin was still at the hut, clutching the knife Edric had sharpened, her breath shallow as she listened to the distant shouts. Wulfric and Edith were awake, their small faces pressed against her, trembling. She'd heard the woman's cry earlier, and now the glow from the church was brighter, the air thick with smoke and fear. She wanted to run to Edric to drag him back, but her feet were rooted. The Reeve's threats, the mark on the tree, the Lord's son's laughter, it all swirled in her mind, a storm she couldn't outrun. She thought of the girl who'd vanished, the stories of the Reeves, favors, and her grip on the knife tightened. She wasn't just protecting her children anymore. She was protecting herself. A sound outside made her jump, a heavy tread in the mud. Her heart stopped. Was it the Reeve? She stepped toward the door, knife raised, ready to fight. At the church, the Lord's son raised his hand higher, silencing the crowd. "Who dares defile God's house?" he bellowed, his voice mocking, his eyes scanning the villagers like a hunter picking prey. The priest pointed at Cynric, his robes flapping. "That one. He's been whispering rebellion, stirring trouble." Cynric's jaw clenched, but he didn't back down, his knife glinting in the firelight. Edric's stomach twisted. He wanted to shout, to tell the priest to shut up, but fear held him. Then old Godric stepped forward, his voice steady despite his trembling frame. "Not him," Godric said, pointing at the mark. "That's no boy's work. That's mine." The crowd gasped, and Edric's breath caught. Godric? The old man who'd seen too many winters, who'd warned them all to stay quiet. It didn't make sense, but his eyes were fierce, unyielding. The Lord's son laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "An old man playing rebel? You'll burn for this." He gestured to the riders, who drew their swords, the metal singing in the night. Cynric lunged forward, his knife raised, shouting, "We're done bowing." The crowd surged, some joining him, others shrinking back. Edric's heart roared. He couldn't stand still anymore. He pushed through, grabbing Cynric's arm. "Stop," he hissed. "You'll get us all killed." But Cynric shook him off, his eyes wild. "Better dead than slaves," he spat. The riders closed in, their horses snorting, and Edric saw the truth. There was no going back. The village was fighting or falling tonight. He looked at the flames, the mark, the Lord's son, and made his choice. He shouted, "For our families," and charged unarmed at the nearest rider. Back at the hut, Elfwin flung open the door, knife in hand, as the Reeve's shadow loomed. His face was smug, his voice low. "No one's coming to save you," he said, stepping closer. "Give me what I want, and I'll keep your family safe." Elfwin's fear turned to rage. She lunged, the knife slashing across his arm. He yelped, stumbling back, blood seeping through his sleeve. "You'll regret that," he snarled, but she stood her ground, her voice steady. "Touch us, and you're dead." The Reeve hesitated, then turned and ran, his curses fading into the night. Elfwin's hands shook, but she felt alive, like she'd reclaimed something the world had tried to take. She grabbed Wulfric and Edith, pulling them toward the church. She had to find Edric. She had to fight. The churchyard was a battlefield now. Cynric and a handful of villagers, Baldwin, Leff, others, clashed with the riders, their knives and pitchforks no match for steel but fueled by desperation. Edric wrestled with a rider, his hands scrabbling for the man's sword. Old Godric was shouting, rallying the others, his voice cutting through the chaos. The priest had fled, his cries of blasphemy forgotten. The Lord's son was still on his horse, his smile gone, his eyes cold as he barked orders. Then, a scream, a woman's voice, not from the fight, but from the church itself. Edric's head snapped toward it. The flames were higher, the roof collapsing, and through the smoke, he saw a figure trapped inside. It was Elfwin's friend, Jitha, the one who'd whispered about the Lord's son, her dress caught in the burning timbers. Edric ran toward her, dodging a rider's swing, his heart screaming for Elfwin, praying she was safe. Cynric was bleeding, a gash on his arm, but he fought on, his knife finding a rider's thigh. The man fell, and Cynric grabbed his sword, heavy but powerful in his hands. The villagers were holding their own, their numbers outmatching the rider's skill. The Lord's son cursed, his horse rearing as he shouted for retreat. The riders began to pull back, but Edric knew it wasn't over. They'd return with more men, more swords. He reached Jitha, dragging her from the flames, her coughs ragged but alive. The church was crumbling, the mark on the wall swallowed by fire. Old Godric was beside him now, his face grim but proud. "We've started something," he said, his voice low. "No stopping now." Edric nodded, his chest heaving, as Elfwin appeared through the crowd, Wulfric and Edith clinging to her. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world stilled. They were alive. They'd fought. They'd won for now. But then the twist. As the riders fled, a new sound rose. Not hoofbeats, but a low, guttural chant. From the woods, figures emerged, cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden. They carried torches, not swords, and their leader stepped forward, pulling back his hood. It was the stranger, the scarred man who'd spoken of rebellion. His eyes burned with a zeal Edric hadn't seen before. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice carrying over the dying flames. "The lords will fall, but not by your hand alone. Join us, or be swept aside." The villagers froze, their victory soured. This wasn't their rebellion anymore. The strangers' men spread out, their torches casting long shadows, and Edric realized the truth. They'd lit the spark, but someone else was fanning the flame. Elfwin's hand found his, her knife still bloody from the reeve. Cynric lowered his stolen sword, his face uncertain. The village had fought for freedom, but now a new shadow loomed, and Edric didn't know if it was salvation or something far worse. The churchyard was a smoldering ruin, the flames dying down to embers as the last of the thatch collapsed in a shower of sparks. Edric stood rooted, his hands still clasped in Elfwin's, her fingers cold and trembling but strong. Wulfric and Edith clung to her skirts, their wide eyes reflecting the glow of the stranger's torches. The scarred man's words hung in the air. "Join us, or be swept aside," like a blade held to the village's throat. His cloaked followers fanned out, their torches casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to crawl over the huddled villagers. Cynric was a few steps away, the stolen sword heavy in his hand, his face a mix of defiance and doubt. Old Godric leaned on a charred beam, his breath ragged, his eyes fixed on the stranger as if he'd seen this story before. The victory over the Lord's son and his riders felt hollow now, swallowed by this new threat. The village had fought for their freedom, but the stranger's chant, low and rhythmic, was a reminder. Freedom wasn't theirs to claim yet. Edric's chest tightened as he scanned the crowd. Jitha, coughing but alive, was supported by two women, her face streaked with soot. Baldwin and Lef, Cynric's grain hiders, stood close, their knives still drawn, their eyes darting between the stranger and the woods. The priest was gone, likely fled to the manor to report the blasphemy, and Edric knew the Lord would answer with fire and steel. But the stranger was here now, his presence a puzzle and a threat. Was he his savior, come to lead them against the Lord? Or was he something worse, using their desperation for his own ends? Edric thought of the mark on the church wall, the slashed circle old Godric had claimed as his own. Had Godric known this man? Had he summoned him? The old man's face gave nothing away, but his silence was heavy. Elfwin's grip tightened, pulling Edric's attention back. Her knife, still stained with the Reeve's blood, was tucked in her belt, her jaw set. She hadn't told him about the Reeve's attack, not yet, but the fire in her eyes said she'd fight again if she had to. "Who is he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the stranger's chant. Edric shook his head, his throat dry. He didn't know, but the stranger's words about the Lord's falling echoed Cynric's earlier talk. Dangerous, tempting, and impossible to ignore. Wulfric tugged at Elfwin's hand, his voice small. "Are they going to hurt us, Mama?" Elfwin knelt, brushing his hair back, her voice soft but firm. "No, love. We're together. That's enough." But her eyes met Edric's, and he saw the truth. Together or not, they were trapped. The stranger stepped closer, his scarred face lit by his torch, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "You've tasted defiance," he said, his voice low but carrying, like a preacher's sermon. "You drove off the Lord's dogs, burned his church. But this is bigger than your village. The Lord's bleed us dry. Here, in Norfolk across England, we're rising village by village to break their chains. Join us, and you'll eat your own grain this winter. Refuse, and you'll burn with the rest." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shrinking back. Cynric's grip on his sword tightened, his eyes bright with the stranger's words. Edric felt the pull too, the dream of a life without the Lord's boot on their necks. But the stranger's men, their faces hidden, their torches too many, felt like a noose tightening. Old Godric coughed, breaking the silence. "I've heard your kind before," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Promising freedom, bringing blood. Who are you, truly?" The stranger's smile was thin, his eyes cold. "A man who's seen the Lord's greed," he said. "A man who knows they'll fall." He didn't answer the question, and Edric's unease grew. Godric's claim to the mark had been a shock, but now Edric wondered if it was a lie to protect someone else, or to draw this man out. Godric's eyes flicked to the stranger's men, then back to Edric, a warning in his gaze. Edric's mind raced. The Lord's Son would return with more riders. The Reeve was likely spilling their secrets, and now this stranger offered salvation with one hand and a threat with the other. The village was a chessboard, and they were all pawns. Cynric stepped forward, his voice sharp. "I'm with you," he said, raising his sword. "No more taxes, no more hunger. Let's finish this." A few villagers cheered, Baldwin and Leff among them, but others hesitated, their faces pale. Edric grabbed Cynric's arm, his voice low. "Thing, lad. We don't know him. What's his price?" Cynric pulled free, his eyes fierce. "The price is staying alive, Edric. You want your kids to starve? Or worse?" Edric flinched, thinking of Wulfric's thin frame, Edith's cough. Cynric was right, but the stranger's chant, now louder, felt like a trap. Elfwin's hand brushed his, her voice urgent. "We can't trust him," she whispered. "But we can't fight alone." Her words were a knife, cutting through his doubt. She was right. They needed allies, but at what cost? The stranger raised his torch, silencing the crowd. "Decide now," he said. "The Lord's men are coming. Stand with us, or die as serfs." The chant grew, a drumbeat of voices, and Edric felt the village splitting, some drawn to the stranger's fire, others to the safety of submission. He thought of the Reeve's greed, the Lord's Son's cruelty, the priest's sermons that justified their suffering. He thought of Elfwin's strength, Wulfric's questions, Edith's trust. He stepped forward, his voice hoarse but clear. "We'll fight," he said, his eyes on the stranger. "But not for you. For us." The crowd stirred, some cheering, others gasping. The stranger's smile widened, but his eyes were unreadable. "Good," he said. "Then arm yourselves. They're here." Hoofbeats thundered, closer than before, and the crowd turned as torches appeared on the road. Not the strangers, but the Lord's. The Lord himself rode at the front, his armor gleaming, his face a mask of rage. The Reeve was beside him, his arm bandaged, his eyes glinting with vengeance. The Lord's Son was there too, his horse limping, but his smile back, sharper than ever. Edric's heart sank. The riders were more than before, their swords drawn, their intent clear. The stranger's men didn't flinch, their chant unbroken, but Edric saw the truth. They were outnumbered, outarmed, and caught between two fires. Elfwin pulled Wulfric and Edith behind her, her knife ready. Cynric raised his sword, Baldwin and Leff flanking him. Old Godric picked up a pitchfork, his hands steady despite his age. The Lord halted, his voice booming. "You've defied God and man," he said, pointing at the ruined church. "Surrender, and some may live. Resist, and your village burns." The Reeve's eyes found Elfwin, and she shuddered, her knife trembling. Edric stepped in front of her, unarmed but unyielding. The stranger laughed, a sound that chilled the air. "No surrender," he said, raising his torch. "We burn them first." His men surged forward, torches arcing toward the riders, and chaos erupted. Edric grabbed a fallen sword, his hands shaking as he joined the fight, Elfwin at his side. The village was a battlefield again, but this time, the stakes were everything. The clash of steel and screams filled the churchyard, a chaotic swirl of firelight and shadow as the Lord's riders charged into the fray. Edric swung his scavenged sword, the weight unfamiliar in his calloused hands, his heart pounding as he parried a rider's blow. Elfwin was at his side, her knife flashing as she guarded Wulfric and Edith, her face fierce despite the fear in her eyes. The stranger's men fought with a ferocity that chilled Edric, their torches not just weapons, but symbols, setting cloaks and saddles ablaze. Cynric was a blur, his stolen sword cutting through the chaos, his voice hoarse as he shouted for the villagers to hold their ground. Old Godric, improbably steady with his pitchfork, drove back a rider, his old bones fueled by a fire Edric hadn't seen in him before. The Lord's voice boomed over the din, promising death, while the Reeve's vengeful glare locked on Elfwin, his bandaged arm not slowing him as he urged the riders forward. The stranger's chant had stopped, replaced by war cries as his cloaked followers clashed with the Lord's men. Edric's mind reeled. Were these allies or another trap? The stranger himself stood back, his scarred face calm, his torch raised like a beacon. He wasn't fighting, just watching, as if the village's blood was a price he'd already calculated. Edric's sword clanged against a rider's shield, the impact jarring his arm, but he held firm, driven by the sight of Elfwin shielding their children. Wulfric's small face was set, his eyes wide, but unyielding, as if he'd absorbed his parents' defiance. Edith clung to Elfwin, her whimpers lost in the chaos. The church was a skeleton now, its timbers blackened, the slashed circle mark barely visible through the smoke. The village was fighting for its life, but Edric felt the stranger's words clawing at him. This is only the beginning. A new sound cut through the battle. A low, rumbling horn from the woods. Not the Lord's, but something older, wilder. The fighting faltered, heads turning as the horn blew again, closer now. The stranger's smile widened, and Edric's stomach twisted. This was no coincidence. From the tree line, more figures emerged, not cloaked like the stranger's men, but ragged, their faces smeared with dirt, their hands clutching axes, sickles, anything that could cut. They were peasants, not from this village, but others, their eyes hollow with hunger and rage. A woman led them, her hair wild, her voice carrying over the horn's echo. "For the land," she shouted, and her band surged forward, crashing into the Lord's riders from the side. The battlefield shifted, the riders caught off guard, their horses rearing as sickles slashed at their legs. Edric froze, his sword lowering for a moment. Who were these people? Allies? Or another faction, drawn by the stranger's promises? Elfwin pulled Wulfric and Edith behind a charred cart, her knife ready, her eyes darting to the newcomers. "Edric," she called, her voice sharp. He snapped back, dodging a rider's blade, and fought his way to her. "Who are they?" she hissed, her breath ragged. He shook his head, his mind racing. The stranger's men were fighting alongside the newcomers, but there was no trust in their movements, more like wolves sharing a kill. Cynric was still in the thick of it, his sword red now, his face a mask of fury. Baldwin and Lef were with him, their knives bloodied, but Edric saw fear in their eyes too. The grain they'd hidden was meaningless now. This was no longer about survival, but something bigger, something they couldn't control. Old Godric was near the church ruins, his pitchfork abandoned, his hands clutching a wound at his side. Edric ran to him, dropping to his knees. "Stay with us," he said, his voice rough. Godric's eyes were dim, but he managed a grim smile. "Knew this day would come," he rasped. "The mark wasn't mine. Hers." He nodded toward the woman leading the newcomers, her silhouette sharp against the firelight. Edric's breath caught. The mark, the slashed circle, wasn't Godric's rebellion, but hers. Had she been here before, planting the seed, or had the stranger brought her? Godric's hand gripped Edric's arm. "She's fire, boy. Burns friend and foe alike. Choose your side carefully." His voice faded, his eyes closing, and Edric felt a pang of loss. Godric had been their anchor, and now he was slipping away. The woman's voice rang out again, rallying her band. "No lords, no chains," she shouted, and her people fought with a desperation that matched the village's. The Lord's son was unhorsed now, his armor dented, his face twisted as he swung his sword at a peasant. The reeve was nowhere to be seen, likely fled or dead in the chaos. The Lord himself was still mounted, his voice roaring orders, but his riders were thinning, caught between the villagers, the strangers' men, and the woman's band. Elfwin pulled Edric close, her knife still in hand. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "The kids, we need to get them out." Edric nodded, his heart torn. He wanted to fight, to end this, but Wulfric and Edith were all that mattered. He grabbed a fallen sickle, its handle slick with blood, and gestured toward the woods. "Go," he said. "I'll cover you." Elfwin hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Not without you," she said, her voice breaking. Before he could argue, the woman from the woods was there, her face close, her eyes burning. "You're the one who spoke," she said to Edric, her voice sharp. "You said you fight for your own. Prove it. Join us, and we'll take the manor, and the Lord for good." Edric stared, his mind reeling. The manor? It was madness, suicide. But her eyes held no doubt, only fire. The stranger was watching too, his torch lowered now, his smile gone. Edric realized they were rivals, not allies, each using the village for their own war. The woman's band was chaos, the stranger's men were cold calculation, and the village was caught in the middle. Cynric staggered over, his arm bleeding, his sword dragging. "She's right," he gasped. "The manor's weak now. We can end this." Edric shook his head, his eyes on Elfwin, on his children. "And then what?" he said. "More blood? More strangers?" Cynric's face hardened, but before he could answer, a scream cut through the air. Wulfric's. Edric spun, his heart stopping. The Lord's son had grabbed the boy, his sword at Wulfric's throat, his eyes wild. "Enough," he shouted. "Surrender, or he dies." Elfwin lunged, her knife raised, but Edric caught her, his voice a desperate whisper. "Wait." The woman from the woods laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Kill him," she said, not to the Lord's son, but to her own men, pointing at the boy. "No hostages. No mercy." Edric's world tilted, the sickle heavy in his hand, as the village burned and the choice loomed. Fight for freedom, or save his son. The churchyard was a maelstrom of fire and blood. Wulfric's scream, still ringing in Edric's ears as the Lord's son held a sword to the boy's throat. Elfwin's knife gleamed in her hand, her body coiled, ready to strike despite Edric's grip on her arm. The woman from the woods stood unmoved, her wild eyes fixed on the scene. Her command, no hostages. No mercy, hanging like a death knell. Her ragged band hesitated, sickles and axes raised, but Edric saw the hunger in their faces, the kind that devoured reason. The strangers' cloaked men held their ground, torches flickering, their leader's scarred face unreadable. Cynric's sword was poised, his breath ragged, torn between joining the woman's charge and saving Wulfric. The Lord's riders, battered but still deadly, rallied around their master, whose voice thundered, "Surrender, or the boy's blood stains your rebellion." The village was a heartbeat from collapse, and Edric's sickle felt like lead in his hand. Elfwin's eyes met Edric's, her voice a desperate hiss. "Do something." He nodded, his mind racing. Wulfric's small face was pale but defiant, his lips trembling but silent. Edith whimpered behind the cart, Elfwin's arm shielding her. Edric stepped forward, sickle raised, his voice cracking but steady. "Let him go," he said to the Lord's son. "This isn't his fight." The boy sneered, his blade pressing closer, a thin line of blood trickling down Wulfric's neck. Edric's heart lurched, but he kept talking, buying time. "You want us? Take me. I'm the one who fought." The crowd held its breath, the flames from the church ruins casting jagged shadows. The woman from the woods laughed, sharp and cold. "No trades," she said. "Kill them both." Her men edged closer, and Edric realized she didn't care who died, villager, lord, or child, as long as the lords fell. Cynric moved before Edric could, lunging at the lord's son with a roar. The boy flinched, his sword shifting, and Wulfric twisted free, scrambling toward Elfwin. Cynric's blade clashed with the lord's son's, sparks flying, but a rider's spear caught Cynric's shoulder, sending him to his knees. Edric charged, his sickle slashing at the rider's arm, blood spraying as the man fell. Elfwin grabbed Wulfric, pulling him behind the cart, her knife ready for anyone who came near. The stranger's men surged forward, their torches igniting a rider's cloak, the man's screams piercing the night. The woman's band joined the fray, their sickles cutting through the chaos, but their aim was wild, striking villager and rider alike. The Lord's voice rose, furious, "Burn it all!" and his men began tossing torches toward the huts, flames catching on thatch. Edric fought his way to Cynric, dragging him behind a stone wall as blood soaked his shoulder. "Stay down," Edric growled, but Cynric's eyes were fierce. "We can't let them win," he gasped, clutching his sword. Edric glanced at the battlefield, the Lord's riders thinning, the stranger's men relentless, the woman's band a whirlwind of rage. The village was burning, smoke choking the air, and Edric's family was in the heart of it. He saw Elfwin fending off a cloaked man, her knife slashing his arm, Wulfric and Edith huddled behind her. The Lord's son was nowhere to be seen, his horse gone. The Lord was fighting on foot now, his armor dented, his face a mask of fury. The Reeve was still missing, his absence a nagging fear in Edric's mind. Where is he? Plotting? Or dead? A new cry rose, not from the fight, but from the manor's direction. Edric's head snapped toward it, his breath catching. Torches bobbed on the hill. Not the lords, but more peasants, their voices a raw chant. No lords, no chains. The woman from the woods turned, her face alight with triumph. "They're here!" she shouted, raising her sickle. Edric's stomach dropped. More rebels, drawn by the fire. The mark, the stranger's whispers. Or were they here for the village, or for her? The stranger's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing as he barked orders to his men. The two factions weren't allies. They were rivals, and the village was their battleground. The Lord's riders faltered, caught between the village's defiance and the new wave of rebels. The Lord himself roared, his sword raised, but his horse stumbled, blood streaming from its flank. Elfwin's voice cut through the chaos, calling Edric's name. He ran to her, sickle in hand, as a rider charged. He swung, the blade biting into the horse's leg, the rider tumbling into the mud. Elfwin's knife found the man's arm, and he fled, cursing. Wulfric was shaking, a bruise on his cheek, but alive. Edith clung to Elfwin, her eyes wide. "We need to go," Elfwin said, her voice steady despite the smoke stinging her eyes. Edric nodded, but the manor's torches were closer, the chant louder. The woman's band cheered, rushing to meet the newcomers, but the stranger's men held back, their torches forming a line. Edric's heart sank. This wasn't salvation. It was a trap within a trap. Cynric staggered to his feet, his shoulder bleeding but his sword raised. "The manor," he rasped. "We take it now, or we're done." Edric grabbed him, his voice low, "And leave them to her." He nodded at the woman, now rallying the new rebels, her voice like thunder. Cynric's face twisted, but he nodded. "Then we fight through," he said. Edric looked at Elfwin, her knife ready, her children behind her. "Stay close," he said, and they moved, weaving through the chaos, dodging flames and blades. The Lord's son was nowhere to be seen, his horse gone. The Lord was fighting on foot now, his armor dented, his face a mask of fury. The stranger's men were circling, their torches closing in, and Edric realized they weren't fighting the Lord. They were herding the villagers toward the woman's band. A scream stopped Edric cold, Jitha's voice from the burning huts. He turned, seeing her silhouette against the flames, a cloaked man dragging her away. The stranger's men? Or the woman's? He didn't know, but Jitha's cries were a knife in his chest. Elfwin's hand gripped his arm. "We can't save everyone," she said, her voice breaking. Edric's jaw clenched, but he nodded, pulling her and the children toward the woods. Sinric covered them, his sword flashing as he drove back a rider. The manor's torches were at the village edge now, the chant a roar, and Edric saw the woman's band clash with the lord's remaining men, sickles against steel. The strangers' men moved in, their torches arcing, and Edric understood. They were using the chaos to eliminate both sides, claiming the village for themselves. The woods loomed, dark and cold, but Edric's hope flickered. If they could reach the trees, they might escape. Elfwin's breath was ragged, Wulfric and Edith stumbling but running. Sinric was behind, his steps slowing, blood dripping from his shoulder. Edric turned to help, but a shadow moved. The Reeve, alive, his face twisted with hate, a dagger in his hand. "Traitors!" he hissed, lunging at Elfwin. Edric swung his sickle, catching the Reeve's arm, but the man's dagger grazed Elfwin's side, her gasp sharp. She stabbed back, her knife sinking in his chest, and he fell eyes wide. Edric caught her as she staggered, blood seeping through her dress. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice tight. The woods were close, but the chant was closer, the flames brighter, and Edric knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The woods loomed just beyond the village's edge, a dark promise of refuge. But the flames and chants behind Edric were a relentless tide. Elfwin leaned against him, her breath shallow, blood seeping from the wound the Reeve's dagger had left. Her knife was still clutched in her hand, slick with the Reeve's blood, her eyes fierce despite the pain. Wulfric and Edith stumbled alongside, their small hands gripping Elfwin's skirts, their faces streaked with soot and fear. Sinric lagged behind, his shoulder a mess of blood, his stolen sword dragging in the mud as he scanned for pursuers. The churchyard was a fading inferno, the clash of steel and screams growing distant but not gone. The woman's rebel band and the stranger's cloaked men were locked in a chaotic dance with the Lord's remaining riders, but Edric knew the village was lost, burning, bleeding, and torn between factions he didn't trust. His sickle was heavy, his heart heavier, as he pushed toward the trees, praying they could vanish before the fire caught them. Elfwin's voice was a strained whisper. "Keep going." She pressed a hand to her side, her face pale but set. Edric's throat tightened. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough. She shook her head, forcing a grim smile. Not enough to stop, but her steps faltered, and he slid an arm around her, half carrying her. Wulfric's eyes were wide, his voice small. "Is Mama okay?" Edric forced a nod. "She's tough, lad. Tougher than me." Edith whimpered, and Elfwin reached down, brushing her daughter's hair. "Hush, love. We're almost safe." But the woods felt impossibly far, and the chants, "No lords, no chains," were closer, the woman's voice rising like a storm. Edric glanced back, seeing torches bobbing at the village's edge, not just the lords but the woman's rebels and the stranger's men, their motives a tangled knot he couldn't unravel. Sinric caught up, his breath ragged, his sword raised despite the blood dripping from his arm. "They're coming," he said, his voice low. "The woman's lot, they're not stopping." Edric's heart sank. The woman's band wasn't just fighting the Lord. They were hunting anyone who didn't join them. Her words, "No mercy," echoed in his mind, and he thought of Jitha's scream, her silhouette vanishing into the flames. Had she been taken by the woman's men, or the strangers? Or was she gone, another casualty of a rebellion that wasn't theirs? Edric gripped his sickle tighter, his eyes on the trees. "We make for the stream," he said. "Lose them in the dark." Sinric nodded, but his face was grim, his strength fading. Edric knew he couldn't carry them all, but he'd die trying. The ground was slick with mud, the air thick with smoke that stung their eyes. Elfwin's wound slowed her, but she pushed on, her knife ready, her children's safety the only thing keeping her upright. Wulfric was quiet now, his small jaw set, as if he'd decided to be brave. Edith's coughs were soft but persistent, the smoke too much for her small lungs. Edric's mind flashed to old Godric, his final words about the woman. "She's fire, burns friend and foe alike." Godric had known her mark, her rebellion. and now Edric wondered if the old man had tried to warn them or pull them into her war. The stranger's cold calculation was no better, his men herding the villagers like sheep to slaughter. The Lord's cruelty, the reeve's greed, the woman's zeal, the stranger's schemes. Every side was ablaze, and the village was bleeding out. A shout broke the night, too close. Edric turned, seeing shadows moving through the smoke. 3 figures, sickles glinting, their voices raw with the woman's chant. "They're hers," Cynric hissed, raising his sword. Edric pushed Elfwin and the children behind a gnarled oak, his sickle ready. "Stay here," he whispered, his eyes on Elfwin. She nodded, her knife raised, guarding Wulfric and Edith. Edric and Cynric stepped out, facing the rebels. The leader, a gaunt man with wild eyes, pointed his sickle. "Join or die," he spat, echoing the woman's words. Edric's voice was steady. "We just want to live." The man laughed, lunging, and Edric swung, his sickle catching the man's arm. Cynric parried another's blow, his sword heavy but true, blood spraying as he struck. The fight was quick, brutal. Edric's sickle found the leader's side, the man collapsing with a gurgle. Cynric felled another, but the third rebel slashed his leg, sending him to his knees. Edric finished the man with a desperate swing, his breath heaving. Cynric groaned, blood pooling under him, his sword slipping from his hand. Edric dragged him to the oak, where Elfwin was waiting, her face pale. "He's hurt bad," she said, tearing a strip from her skirt to bind Cynric's leg. Wulfric's eyes were wide, but he helped, his small hand steady. Edith clung to Elfwin, her cough's worse now. Edric's heart twisted. Cynric was fading, Elfwin was bleeding, and the woods were no guarantee of safety. The chants were louder, torches closer, and he knew they couldn't outrun the fire. A rustle in the trees made Edric spin, sickle raised, but it was no rebel, just a boy, barely older than Wulfric, his face dirty, his eyes wide. "This way," the boy whispered, gesturing deeper into the woods. Edric hesitated, his trust worn thin, but Elfwin's voice was firm. "We've no choice." Edric nodded, helping Cynric to his feet, the man's weight heavy on his shoulder. The boy led them, silent and quick, through tangled roots and shadows, toward the faint sound of running water. The stream was close, its banks hidden by ferns, and Edric felt a flicker of hope. If they could cross it, they might lose their pursuers. But Cynric's steps faltered, his breath a rattle, and Edric knew he wouldn't make it far. Elfwin's wound was bleeding through her bandage, her face gray, but she kept moving, her children her anchor. The boy stopped at the stream's edge, pointing to a hollow under a willow's roots. "Hide there," he said, his voice low. "They won't cross tonight." Edric's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The boy's face was unreadable. "Someone who ran," he said, and vanished into the trees. Edric helped Cynric into the hollow, Elfwin and the children following. The space was tight, damp, but hidden, the willow's roots a curtain against the world. Cynric's breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering. Elfwin pressed her hand to his, her voice soft. "Hold on, Cynric. You're not done." He managed a weak smile, but his strength was gone. Wulfric and Edith curled against Elfwin, their small bodies shaking, and Edric sat at the entrance, sickle in hand, watching the darkness. The chants faded, the torches dimmed, but Edric didn't relax. The woman's rebels, the stranger's men, the Lord's riders, they were still out there, their wars spilling over the village's ashes. He thought of Jitha, of old Godric, of the mark that had started all. The boy's words, "someone who ran," stuck with him. Was running enough? Or would the fire find them again? Elfwin's hand found his, her touch cold but steady, and he looked at her, their children, Cynric's fading form. They'd fought, bled, survived, but for what? The stream whispered, the woods waited, and Edric knew the dawn would bring new choices, new blades, new fires. The hollow under the willow's roots was a damp, cramped refuge, the air heavy with the smell of earth and blood. Edric sat at the entrance, his sickle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the stream's faint glimmer. Elfwin leaned against the root wall, her breath uneven, her hand pressed to the wound at her side, now crusted with blood but still seeping. Wulfric and Edith were curled against her, their small bodies shivering despite her arms around them. Cynric lay slumped nearby, his breathing shallow, his face gray in the dim light filtering through the roots. The chants and torches had faded, but the night was alive with distant cries and the occasional crack of burning timber from the village. Edric's heart was a lead weight. He'd gotten them this far, but safety felt like a lie, and the boy who'd led them here, someone who ran, was a ghost in his mind. The rebellion, the lord, the stranger, the woman, they were all shadows waiting to pounce. Elfwin's voice broke the silence, soft but sharp. "We can't stay here long." Her eyes met Edric's, her pain clear but her resolve stronger. He nodded, his throat tight. "Stream will hide our tracks," he said, his voice low. "We cross at dawn, head west." He didn't know where west would lead. Another village, another lord, maybe worse, but staying meant death. Wulfric stirred, his small voice trembling. "What about our hut? Our things?" Edric's chest ached. He reached over, ruffling the boy's hair. "We'll make a new home, lad. Together." The words felt hollow, but Wulfric's nod was enough for now. Edith's coughs were quieter, but each one was a knife in Edric's gut. The smoke had done its work, and they had no herbs, no healer, only hope. Cynric groaned, his eyes fluttering open, glassy with pain. "Should have taken the manor," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Elfwin shushed him, her hand on his. "Rest, Cynric. You've done enough." But his eyes were fierce, fixed on Edric. "You ran," he said, each word a struggle. "We could have ended it." Edric's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to say saving his family was worth more than a doomed fight, but Cynric's words stung. Had he failed the village? Jitha's scream, old Godric's death, the mark on the church, they haunted him. He thought of the woman's fire, the stranger's cold smile, the Lord's rage. "We're alive," Edric said finally, his voice hard. "That's enough for now." Cynric's eyes closed, his breath slowing, and Edric feared it might stop altogether. The night dragged. The streams whisper a constant murmur against the distant chaos. Edric's eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion, but he didn't dare sleep. Elfwin's wound needed tending, but they had nothing, no cloth, no water clean enough to wash it. She caught his gaze, her voice a whisper. "I'll make it, Edric. For them." She nodded at Wulfric and Edith, now asleep, their faces softer in the dark. Edric's hand found hers, their fingers interlocking, her touch grounding him. She hadn't told him about the Reeves attack, the knife she'd driven into his chest, but he saw it in her eyes, a weight she carried alone. "You're enough," he said, the words clumsy but true. Her faint smile was a spark in the gloom. A twig snapped outside, and Edric's grip on the sickle tightened, his body tense. He peered through the roots, seeing only shadows, but his pulse raced. Was it the woman's rebels, hunting stragglers? The stranger's men, tying up loose ends? Or just a deer, startled by the village's ruin? He held his breath, waiting, but no more sounds came. The boy's words, "They won't cross tonight," echoed, but Edric didn't trust them. The boy had appeared like a wraith, led them here, then vanished. Was he a runaway, like he'd said, or something else? A scout, a traitor? Edric's mind spun, every choice a gamble, every moment a blade's edge. He glanced at Cynric, whose chest barely moved, and knew they couldn't stay past dawn. They had to move, wounded or not. Elfwin shifted, wincing, her voice low. "What they find us?" She didn't mean the Lord's men. She meant the rebels, the woman's fire, the stranger's schemes. Edric's jaw tightened. "We fight," he said, his hand on the sickle, "or we run farther." Her eyes searched his, and he saw her fear, not for herself, but for Wulfric and Edith. "We'll find a place," she said, more to herself than him. "Somewhere they can grow." Edric wanted to believe her, but the world beyond the woods was a mystery. Lords, taxes, hunger, all waiting. The rebellion had promised freedom, but it had brought fire instead. The mark, the chance, the blood. It was all a chain, just a different kind. Cynric stirred again, his voice a faint croak. The grain. Edric leaned closer, frowning. What? Cynric's eyes were distant, feverish. In the woods, we hid it. For the village. Edric's heart sank. The grain they'd stashed, the spark of their defiance. It was still out there, buried under leaves, unless the rebels had found it. Rest, he said, but Cynric's words lit a spark. If they could find the grain, they might eat, might survive a little longer. But the woods were crawling with danger, and Cynric was dying, Elfwin bleeding, the children weak. Edric's hand tightened on the sickle, torn between hope and dread. The grain was a chance, but reaching it meant risking everything. The sky was graying, dawn creeping through the trees, when a new sound reached them. Not chants or hooves, but a soft, rhythmic thud, like footsteps. Edric tensed, sickle ready, peering through the roots. A figure moved in the mist, small and quick, and his heart leapt. The boy again, his face pale, his eyes wide. "You need to go," the boy whispered, crouching low. "They're searching the woods." Edric's voice was a hiss. "Who?" The boy's eyes darted. "Her men. The woman. She wants everyone sworn to her." Edric's stomach twisted. The woman's fire hadn't burned out. She was claiming the survivors, building her army. "Why help us?" he asked, his trust thin. The boy's face hardened. "My sister." She didn't run. They took her. He vanished again, leaving Edric's mind reeling. Elfwin's voice was urgent. "We move now." She was already standing, wincing, her knife in hand, Wulfric and Edith clinging to her. Edric helped Cynric up, the man's weight nearly buckling him, his breath a faint wheeze. They slipped from the hollow, the stream's cold water biting their legs as they crossed, mud sucking at their boots. The woods were thick, dawn's light barely piercing the canopy, but every rustle was a threat. Edric led, sickle raised, Elfwin behind with the children, Cynric dragging at the rear. The boy's warning burned in his mind. The woman's men were close, their sickles ready, their mercy gone. The grain was out there, but survival was closer, and Edric's eyes scanned the trees, praying for a path. A shout rang out, sharp and near, and Edric froze, his heart hammering. Torches flickered through the trees, voices chanting faintly, the woman's fire spreading. Elfwin's hand gripped his, her knife ready, her children silent but trembling. Cynric's eyes were dull, his sword useless now, his life slipping away. The woods were no refuge. They were a trap, and the dawn was their enemy, lighting their trail. Edric's sickle gleamed, his choice clear: fight, run, or die. The chants grew louder, the torches closer, and he whispered, "Stay low," leading them deeper, the grain a fading dream, survival the only spark left. Show and sidebar. The woods were a maze of shadows and whispers, dawn's pale light barely piercing the thick canopy as Edric led the way, his sickle gripped tight, every rustle a potential threat. Elfwin followed close, her steps uneven, the wound in her side a dull throb. She hid behind a clenched jaw. Wulfric and Edith clung to her, their small faces pale, their eyes darting at every snap of a twig. Cynric staggered at the rear, his breath a faint wheeze, blood seeping from his shoulder and leg, his stolen sword now a crutch more than a weapon. The woman's rebels were out there, their chants, no lords, no chains. Fainter but relentless, their torches flickering through the trees like predators' eyes. The boy's warning echoed in Edric's mind. The woman wanted everyone sworn to her, and those who ran were prey. The grain Cynric had hidden was a distant hope, survival the only goal, but the woods felt like a closing trap, and Edric's heart pounded with the weight of keeping them alive. Elfwin's voice was a low hiss, barely audible over the stream's murmur behind them. "How far can we go?" Her hand pressed her side, blood staining her fingers, but her eyes were sharp, fixed on Wulfric and Edith. Edric's throat tightened. "Far enough," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He didn't know where they were headed, west, toward rumors of free lands, or just away from the fire and blades. Wulfric's small hand tugged at Elfwin's skirt, his voice trembling. "Are we lost, Papa?" Edric forced a grim smile. kneeling to meet his son's eyes. "Not lost, lad. Just finding a new path." The lie tasted bitter, but Wulfric's nod gave him strength. Edith's coughs were softer now, but each one was a reminder of the smoke they'd fled, the village they'd lost. Cynric stumbled, his sword scraping the ground, and Edric caught him before he fell, his arm burning under the man's weight. "Hold on," Edric muttered, his eyes scanning the trees. Cynric's face was ashen, his voice a croak. "Leave me, get them out." Edric's jaw clenched. "Not leaving anyone." Cynric's weak chuckle was cut off by a cough, blood flecking his lips. "Stubborn bastard." Elfwin glanced back, her knife ready, her face torn between fear and resolve. "We stay together," she said, her voice final. Edric nodded, hauling Cynric upright, but the man's weight was a chain, slowing them with every step. The chants were closer now, the woman's voice a distant thunder, and Edric knew they couldn't outrun her fire. Not like this. The ground sloped downward, roots snagging their boots, and Edric spotted a clearing ahead, the stream curving through it, its banks thick with reeds. Hope flickered. If they could hide there, rest, maybe bind Elfwin's wound, Cynric's bleeding. But a shadow moved in the clearing, and Edric froze, raising his sickle, signaling the others to crouch. A figure stood by the stream, not cloaked like the stranger's men or ragged like the woman's rebels, but in rough wool, a bough slung across their back. Edric's pulse raced. A hunter? A scout? He couldn't tell, but the figure hadn't seen them yet, their head bent, filling a waterskin. Elfwin's hand gripped his arm, her knife glinting, her eyes questioning. Edric whispered, "Wait," and crept closer, sickle ready, praying for an ally but expecting a foe. The figure turned, and Edric's breath caught. It was a woman, older than Elfwin, her face weathered, her eyes sharp. She raised her bow. An arrow knocked, but didn't shoot, her gaze flicking over Edric's sickle, his blood-streaked face. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low, wary. Edric kept his sickle raised, his voice steady. "Fleeing the village." "You with them?" He nodded toward the distant chants. The woman's eyes narrowed, her bow steady. "With no one. Saw the fire, heard the madness." "You running from the Lord or the rebels?" Edric hesitated, trust a luxury he couldn't afford, but Elfwin stepped forward, her knife lowered, Wulfric and Edith behind her. "We're running for our lives," she said, her voice raw. The woman's bow dipped, her eyes softening at the children's faces. "Name's Hilda," the woman said, slinging her bow. "Live out here, away from lords and fools." "You're hurt." She nodded at Elfwin's side, Cynric's slump. Edric's grip on the sickle didn't loosen. "Can you help?" Hilda's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Maybe, if you're not trouble." She gestured to a path hidden by ferns. "My place ain't far. Move quick before they find you." Edric glanced at Elfwin, her nod faint but sure. They had no choice. Cynric was fading, Elfwin's strength waning. He helped Cynric forward, Elfwin and the children following, Hilda leading, her steps silent, her bow ready. The chants were still there, but fainter, the torches dimmer, and Edric dared to hope the woods might shield them. Hilda's hut was a low, moss-covered thing, tucked against a rocky outcrop, nearly invisible in the dawn light. Inside, it smelled of herbs and smoke, a small fire crackling in a stone hearth. Hilda pointed to a straw mat. "Lay him there," she said, nodding at Cynric. Edric eased him down, Cynric's breath a faint rattle. Hilda knelt, her hands quick, peeling back his blood-soaked shirt, her face grim. "Bad," she muttered, grabbing a pouch of dried leaves. Elfwin sat, wincing, as Hilda checked her wound, her fingers probing gently. "You'll live if you rest," Hilda said, handing her a cloth to press against it. Wulfric and Edith huddled close, their eyes wide but curious, Edith's coughs easing in the warm air. Edric stood by the door, sickle in hand, watching the woods through a narrow window. Hilda worked in silence, grinding herbs, binding Cynric's wounds, her hands steady despite his fading pulse. Elfwin's voice was soft. "Why help us?" Hilda didn't look up. Seen too many die for lords or dreams. Kids don't deserve that. Edric's chest tightened, thinking of the boy who'd led them to the stream, his sister taken by the rebels. Was Hilda another runaway, or something more? Her bow, her solitude, her knowledge. They spoke of a life apart, but not without cost. Cynric stirred, his voice a whisper. The grain, near the old oak. Hilda's eyes flicked to him. Then Edric. You had food? She asked, her voice sharp. Edric nodded, wary. For the village. Before it burned. Hilda's mouth tightened. Fools. That's what draws them. Food, hope, blood. A distant shout cut through the quiet, and Edric spun, sickle raised, peering through the window. Torches flickered, closer than before, the woman's chant faint but growing. Hilda cursed, grabbing her bow. They're tracking, she said, her voice low. Stay here, keep quiet. She slipped out, vanishing into the ferns, her movements like a shadow. Elfwind's hand found Edric's, her knife ready, her eyes on the children. If they come, she started, but he cut her off, his voice firm. They won't. But his heart raced, the sickle heavy, as the chants grew louder, the woods no longer a shield but a cage. Cynric's breath was a faint whisper, Wulfric's eyes wide, Edith's small hand clutching Elfwind's. The grain, the rebellion, the village, they were ghosts now, and survival was all that remained, a spark in the dark, flickering against the fire closing in. Showing sidebar. The air in Hilda's hut was thick with the scent of herbs and the faint tang of blood, the small fire casting flickering shadows on the mossy walls. Edric stood by the narrow window, his sickle clutched tight, his eyes straining to pierce the dawnlit woods where the woman's rebels were closing in. The chants, no lords, no chains, were a low rumble, the torches glow weaving through the trees like fireflies with teeth. Elfwind sat by the hearth, her wound bound with Hilda's cloth, her knife resting on her knee, her face pale but fierce as she watched Wulfric and Edith. The children were huddled close, their eyes heavy but alert, Edith's coughs softer in the warm air. Cynric lay on the straw mat, his breath a faint, uneven rasp, his wounds bandaged, but his life slipping through Hilda's skilled hands. Edric's heart was a drum, each beat a reminder of the fire they'd fled, the blades they'd faced, and the choice now looming. Stay and fight, or run again. Hilda was gone, her bow in hand, vanished into the ferns to scout the rebels' approach. Her warning, their tracking, burned in Edric's mind, her sharp words about the grain echoing Cynric's fevered mutterings. The hidden stash, meant to save the village, was now a beacon for the woman's hungry followers. Elfwind's voice cut through his thoughts, low and urgent. We can't wait for her. Her eyes flicked to the window, then back to the children. Edric nodded, his throat tight. If they find us, he didn't finish, but her grip on the knife tightened, her answer clear. Wulfric's small voice broke the tension. Will Hilda come back? Edric forced a grim smile. She's tough, lad, like your ma. But doubt gnawed at him. Hilda's help was a gift, but her solitude spoke of secrets, and trust was a risk they couldn't afford. Cynric stirred, his voice a weak croak. The oak, north of the stream, his eyes were glassy, fixed on nothing, but his words were a spark. Edric knelt beside him, his voice low. Rest, Cynric. We'll find it. But Cynric's hand gripped his arm, weak but desperate. Don't let them take it. Edric's chest ached. The grain was their defiance, their hope, but reaching it meant crossing the rebels' path. Elfwind's eyes met his, her voice steady despite her pain. If we get it, we eat. If we don't, she didn't need to say more. Wulfric and Edith were thin, their faces hollow, and hunger was a blade as sharp as any sword. Edric nodded, his sickle heavy in his hand. We move soon, he said, his mind racing, north, to the oak, then west, away from the fire. A sharp whistle pierced the air, and Edric spun, sickle raised, peering through the window. Hilda's silhouette emerged from the ferns, her bow slung, her face grim. She slipped inside, her voice a hiss. They're close, 6, maybe 7, with sickles and torches. Following the stream. Edric's heart sank. The woman's rebels were relentless, their hunger for recruits, or blood, driving them deeper into the woods. Elfwin stood, wincing, her knife ready. "Can we fight?" Hilda's eyes flicked to Cynric, then the children, her mouth a hard line. "Not with him dying and you bleeding. Run, or you're dead." Wulfric's eyes widened, but he stayed silent, his small hand clutching Edith's. Edric's jaw clenched. Running again felt like surrender, but staying was suicide. Hilda grabbed a small sack from a corner, stuffing it with dried herbs and a water skin. "Take this," she said, thrusting it at Elfwin. "Head north, cross the stream again, keep low. The oak's a day's walk, if you're quick." Edric's eyes narrowed. "You know it." Hilda's gaze was steady. "I know these woods. Hid my own food once, before I learned better." Her voice held a weight, a story she didn't tell, and Edric wondered what she'd fled: lords, rebels, or something worse. Elfwin's voice was soft but firm. "Come with us." Hilda shook her head, her bow already in hand. "I'll draw them off. Buy you time." Edric's chest tightened. "Why risk it?" Hilda's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Kids don't deserve this. Go." The chants were louder now. The torches glowed brighter through the trees. Edric helped Cynric up, the man's weight nearly buckling him, his breath a faint wheeze. Elfwin slipped the sack over her shoulder, her knife in hand, Wulfric and Edith clinging to her. Hilda led them to a hidden path behind the hut, ferns masking their steps. "Stay off the stream's edge," she whispered. "They're watching it." She vanished into the woods, her bow ready, her steps silent. Edric led the way, sickle raised, Elfwin behind with the children, Cynric dragging at the rear. The air was cold, the dawn light gray, every shadow a threat. The chants were a constant hum, the woman's voice a distant roar, and Edric's heart pounded with each step north, toward the oak, toward hope. The woods thickened, roots snagging their boots, branches clawing their faces. Elfwin's wound slowed her, but she pushed on, her knife glinting, her children's safety her anchor. Wulfric was quiet, his small jaw set, carrying Edith's hand like a shield. Edith's coughs were faint, her steps faltering, and Edric's gut twisted. Hunger, smoke, fear were wearing her down. Cynric's breath was a rattle, his eyes half closed, but he kept moving, his will stronger than his body. Edric scanned the trees, praying Hilda's diversion worked, but a shout, sharp, close, shattered that hope. Torches flickered to their left, voices chanting, sickles glinting. Elfwin's hand gripped his arm, her voice a hiss. "They're here." Edric's sickle gleamed, his choice stark: fight or hide. He pulled them behind a fallen log, its moss damp against their backs, the children trembling but silent. Cynric slumped, his sword useless, his breath fading. The rebels were close, their torches casting jagged shadows, their voices raw with the woman's fire. Edric peered over the log, counting 5 figures, sickles raised, their leader a broad man with a scarred face, barking orders. "Spread out. They're near." Elfwin's knife was ready, her eyes on the children, her wound forgotten. Wulfric's small hand clutched a stick, his face fierce, and Edric's heart broke. He was too young for this. Edith's eyes were wide, her cough stifled, and Edric prayed they'd stay unseen. The rebels passed, their torches fading, but Edric didn't move, his breath held, waiting for the trap to spring. A scream, Hilda's, rang out distant but sharp, followed by a clash of steel. Elfwin's eyes met his, her voice a whisper. "She's fighting for us." Edric nodded, guilt clawing at him. Hilda was risking her life, a stranger who owed them nothing, while the grain, the oak, the west were still out of reach. He helped Cynric up, the man's weight crushing, and led them onward, the stream's murmur guiding them north. The chants were fainter, Hilda's diversion working, but the woods were alive, every rustle a blade, every shadow a foe. The oak loomed ahead, its gnarled branches a beacon in the gray light, its roots thick with leaves. Cynric's eyes flickered, a weak nod confirming it. The grain was here, or had been. Edric's sickle dug into the earth, Elfwin helping despite her pain, Wulfric's small hands clawing at the dirt. A sack emerged, heavy, untouched, and Edric's heart leapt. Food, life, a chance. But a new shout, closer than before, killed that hope. Torches flared, the woman's voice roaring, and Edric knew the fire had found them again. The grain a spark they'd die to keep. Showing sidebar. The oak's gnarled roots clutched the earth like ancient hands. The sack of grain heavy in Edric's arms. Its weight a fleeting victory against the hunger that gnawed at them all. Elfwind stood beside him, her knife slick with mud, her wound seeping through Hilda's cloth, her breath sharp with pain, but her eyes fierce. Wulfric's small hands were dirt-streaked, his face set with a determination too old for his years, while Edith clung to Elfwind, her coughs faint but persistent, her eyes wide with fear. Cynric slumped against the tree, his breath a shallow rattle, blood pooling under him, his stolen sword useless in his weakening grip. The woman's rebels were closing in, their chance. No lords, no chains. A rising storm, their torches flaring through the gray dawn. The woman's voice a roar that shook the woods. Edric's sickle gleamed in his hand, the grain a spark of hope now threatened by the fire bearing down on them. Elfwind's voice was a strained whisper, her eyes on the flickering torches. "We can't stay." She hoisted the sack over her shoulder, wincing, her knife ready. Edric nodded, his heart hammering. The oak was no sanctuary. The rebels had tracked them, drawn by the grain or the boy's betrayal, and Hilda's diversion had only bought them moments. Wulfric tugged at Edric's sleeve, his voice small but steady. "Where do we go, Papa?" Edric's throat tightened, the west a vague promise, freedom a dream drowned in blood. "Across the stream again," he said, his voice low. "We lose them in the thickets." Edith's small hand gripped Elfwind's, her coughs muffled, and Edric's gut twisted. Hunger, cold, and fear were wearing her thin, and the grain might not be enough to save her. Cynric's eyes flickered open, glassy with fever, his voice a croak. "Leave me, take the grain." Edric knelt beside him, his jaw clenched. "Not happening." Cynric's weak smile was grim. "I'm done, Edric. Save them." Elfwind's face hardened, her knife glinting as she crouched by Cynric. "You're not done till we say," she said, her voice fierce. She tore another strip from her skirt, binding his leg tighter, but the blood kept coming, his breath fading. Edric hauled him up, Cynric's weight crushing his shoulder, the grain sack slung over the other. The chants were louder, the torches closer, and Edric knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the woman's fire swallowed them. The stream was a silver thread through the woods, its banks thick with ferns, but the rebels' shouts were too near, their sickles glinting in the dawnlight. Edric led the way, sickle raised, Elfwind behind with the children and the grain, Cynric dragging between them. The ground was slick, roots snagging their boots, and Edith stumbled, her small cry cut off by Elfwind's quick hand over her mouth. Wulfric's eyes were wide, his stick clutched like a sword, and Edric's heart broke. He was too young to fight, too small to run forever. The woman's voice roared again, closer, her words ablade. "Find them. No mercy." Edric's mind flashed to Hilda's scream, the clash of steel. Had she fallen, or was she still fighting? Guilt clawed at him, but survival was all that mattered now. A shadow moved ahead, and Edric froze, sickle ready, signaling the others to crouch. A figure stood by the stream, not a rebel but the boy, his pale face streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with panic. "This way," he hissed, pointing to a narrow path through the thickets. Edric's grip tightened, trust a fragile thing. "Why keep helping?" he growled, his voice low. The boy's eyes darted to the torches, his voice shaking. "They took my sister, but you've got kids. Hurry." Elfwind's nod was faint, her knife ready, and Edric followed, Cynric's weight slowing them, the grain a burden they couldn't drop. The boy led them through brambles, thorns tearing at their clothes, the stream's murmur masking their steps. The path opened into a hollow, a tangle of vines and roots hiding a shallow cave, its mouth barely visible. The boy pointed, his voice urgent. "In there. They won't see." Edric hesitated, The cave a potential trap, but the rebels' shouts were too close, their torches flaring. He helped Cynric inside, the man's breath a faint wheeze, Elfwin and the children following, the grain sack dragged behind. The cave was damp, cramped, the air heavy with moss, but it was cover. The boy stayed outside, his eyes on the woods. "I'll watch," he whispered, vanishing into the thickets. Edric's heart raced. Was he leading the rebels here, or buying them time? The boy's sister, taken by the woman's fire, was a ghost in his words, and Edric prayed his help was true. Inside, Elfwin set the grain sack down, her wound bleeding through the cloth, her knife still in hand. She pulled Wulfric and Edith close, their small bodies trembling. Edith coughs stifled against her chest. Cynric slumped against the wall, his eyes closed, his breath a faint thread. Edric knelt by him, his voice low. "Hold on, Cynric. We're not losing you." But Cynric's face was gray, his life draining into the earth. Elfwin's eyes met Edric's, her voice a whisper. "We need a rest, just a little." Edric nodded, his sickle by the cave's mouth, his eyes on the woods. The chants were fainter, the torches dimmer, but the woman's fire was relentless, and he knew they weren't safe. Wulfric's small voice broke the silence, his eyes on the grain sack. "Is that enough to eat, Papa?" Edric's chest ached, the sack a lifeline, but not a future. "It'll keep us strong," he said, his voice steady, "till we find a new home." Edith's hand clutched Elfwin's, her voice tiny. "We'll be like our old one." Elfwin's smile was strained, her wound forgotten as she brushed Edith's hair. "Better, love. With you too." The lie was kind, and Edric clung to it, the cave a fleeting shield against the world's blades. The woman's rebels, the stranger's schemes, the Lord's wrath. They were all out there, but here, for a moment, they were together. A rustle outside made Edric tense, sickle raised, his breath held. The boy's face appeared, pale and urgent. "They're past the stream," he whispered, "but they're circling back. You gotta move soon." Edric's jaw clenched. "How many?" The boy's eyes darted. "Too many. She's with them." The woman herself, her fire leading the hunt. Elfwin's hand gripped Edric's, her knife ready, her voice low. "We can't outrun them forever." Edric nodded, the grain heavy, Cynric fading, the children weak. The West was a dream, but the cave was real, and the boy's eyes held a truth Edric couldn't ignore. "Stay low," he said, helping Cynric up, Elfwin lifting the grain, Wulfric and Edith silent but ready. The chants surged, the torches flared, and Edric led them deeper into the woods, the grain a spark they'd fight to keep, the fire a shadow they'd never escape. The cave's damp walls pressed close, the air heavy with moss and fear as Edric crouched by the entrance, his sickle tight in his hand. The woman's chants roared outside, her rebels' torches casting jagged shadows through the woods, her voice a thunder that shook the earth. Elfwin clutched the grain sack, her wound bleeding through Hilda's cloth, her knife ready, her eyes fierce despite the pain. Wulfric and Edith huddled against her, their small faces pale, their breaths quick and quiet. Cynric's breath was a faint wheeze, his body slumped against the cave wall, his life fading with each shallow gasp. The boy's warning, "She's with them," burned in Edric's mind, the woman herself leading the hunt, her fire relentless. The grain was their lifeline, but the cave was a trap, and the woods offered no escape. Edric's heart pounded, the West a fading dream, survival the only spark left. Elfwin's whisper was sharp, her eyes on the flickering torches. "We can't run." She shifted the grain sack, wincing, her knife glinting. Edric nodded, his throat tight. The woman's rebels were too close, their sickles hungry, their mercy gone. Wulfric's small hand clutched Elfwin's, his voice barely audible. "Papa, what do we do?" Edric's chest ached, his son's trust a weight he couldn't bear to fail. "We stay together," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. Edith's coughs were soft, her small body trembling, and Edric knew hunger and cold were as deadly as the blades outside. Cynric's eyes flickered, his voice a croak. "The grain, keep it safe." Edric gripped his shoulder, his voice low. "We will, Cynric. Rest now." But Cynric's breath stopped, his eyes still, and Elfwin's hand covered her mouth, a silent sob shaking her. The chant surged, the woman's voice closer, her words ablade. "No lords, no chains, no cowards." Edric peered through the cave's mouth, seeing torches flare, sickles glint, the woman's wild hair a silhouette against the dawn. The boy was gone, his watch abandoned, and Edric wondered if he'd fled or been caught. Hilda's scream echoed in his memory. Had she fallen, her bow broken, her sacrifice in vain? Guilt gnawed at him, but Elfwin's hand found his, her touch grounding him. "For them," she whispered, nodding at Wulfric and Edith. Edric nodded, his sickle ready, the grain sack a burden they'd die for. The rebels were steps away, their shadows stretching into the cave, and Edric braced for the fight, knowing it might be their last. A new sound cut through the chants, a horn, low and wild, not the woman's or the lord's, but something older from deeper in the woods. The rebels faltered, their torches wavering, the woman's voice pausing. Edric's heart leapt, hope a fragile spark. Elfwin's eyes met his, her knife still raised, her breath held. The horn blew again, closer, and shouts followed. Not the woman's rebels, but others, their voices raw but different. Figures emerged from the trees, not cloaked or ragged, but in homespun, armed with pitchforks and staffs, their faces weathered but determined. A man led them, gray-haired, his voice booming. "Enough blood. Leave these woods." The woman's rebels turned, sickles raised, but the newcomers were many, their resolve a wall against her fire. Edric watched, frozen, as the woman's voice rose in defiance, her sickle slashing the air. "No surrender," she roared, charging the gray-haired man, but his staff cracked against her arm, sending her stumbling. Her rebels fought, sickles clashing with pitchforks, but the newcomers were steady, their numbers overwhelming. Elfwin's whisper was urgent. "Now, Edric." He nodded, helping her lift the grain sack, pulling Wulfric and Edith close. They slipped from the cave, keeping low, the battle's chaos masking their steps. The stream's icy water bit at Edric's legs as he waded across, the grain sack heavy on his shoulder, Elfwin's hand steadying Wulfric and Edith behind him. The clash of pitchforks and sickles echoed through the woods. The woman's rebels locked in battle with the gray-haired man's band, their horns still ringing in the dawn air. Edric's heart pounded, the cave's shadow fading, Cynric's still form a weight in his chest. Elfwin's wound slowed her, blood seeping through the cloth, but her knife was ready, her eyes fierce for their children. Wulfric's small face was set, his stick clutched tight, while Edith's coughs were faint, her small hand gripping Elfwin's. The west was a whisper of hope, the grain their lifeline, and Edric pushed through the thickets, praying the battle would keep the rebels at bay. The woods thickened, brambles snagging their clothes, the chants and clashes growing faint. Elfwin's breath was ragged, her steps faltering, and Edric slid an arm around her, taking the grain sack. "Lean on me," he said, his voice rough. She nodded, her knife still in hand, her strength fading, but her will iron. Wulfric's voice was small, his eyes on the trees. "Who were those people, Papa?" Edric shook his head, the gray-haired man a mystery. Villagers from another settlement, perhaps tired of the woman's fire or the Lord's chains. "Friends for now," he said, hoping it was true. Edith stumbled, her cough sharper, and Elfwin knelt, brushing her hair back. "We're almost there, love," she lied, her voice soft. The west was unknown, but staying meant death. The ground sloped upward, the trees thinning, and Edric spotted a ridge ahead, its crest offering a view of the land beyond. Hope flickered. If they could reach it, they might find a path, a village, anything but fire and blades. But a rustle stopped him cold, his sickle raised, Elfwin's knife glinting beside him. The boy emerged, his face pale, his eyes wide, blood streaking his arm. "They're breaking," he gasped, nodding toward the battle's distant roar. "Her rebels, some ran, some fell." But she's alive, hunting. Edric's stomach twisted. The woman's fire hadn't died, and her vengeance would follow them. "Why stay with us?" he asked, his trust thin. The boy's eyes dropped. "My sister, she's gone. You're all I got left." Elfwind's hand rested on the boy's shoulder, her voice soft. "You're with us now." The boy nodded, his eyes wet, and Edric felt a pang. Another soul to carry, but one who'd saved them twice. "Name's Leofric," the boy said, his voice steadier. Edric gripped his sickle, nodding. "Keep up, Leofric. We're moving." They climbed the ridge, Elfwind's wound slowing her. Edith's cough's a constant ache in Edric's chest. The grain sack was heavy, but it was life, bread, strength, a chance for Wulfric and Edith to grow. The battle's noise faded, the woods quiet but for their steps, and Edric dared to hope the woman's fire was behind them. The ridge's crest revealed a valley below, green fields stretching west, dotted with huts, smoke curling from chimneys. Edric's breath caught. A village, alive, untouched by the rebellion's flames. Elfwind's hand found his, her voice a whisper. "Is it safe?" He didn't know, but the sight of tilled earth, children running in the distance, felt like a dream after the village's ashes. Leofric's eyes widened, his voice soft. "Looks like home before." Wulfric's small hand tugged at Edric's. "Can we stay, Papa?" Edric knelt, his heart torn. "We'll try, lad," he said, his voice thick. Edith's coughs eased in the clean air, and Elfwind's faint smile was a spark of hope. They descended, the grain sack shared between Edric and Leofric, Elfwind leaning on Wulfric's small shoulder, Edith in her arms. The village grew closer, faces turning toward them, wary but not hostile. A woman approached, older, her apron flour-dusted, her eyes kind but sharp. "You're from the east?" she asked, her gaze on their bloodied clothes, the grain sack. Edric nodded, his sickle lowered. "Fled the fighting. We mean no harm." The woman's eyes softened at Edith's cough, Wulfric's thin frame. "No lords here," she said. "Just us working the land. You got food." Edric lifted the grain sack, its weight a silent offer. "Enough to share," he said, and the woman's smile was a door opening. She led them to a hut, warm with the smell of bread, a healer waiting with herbs and clean cloth. Elfwind's wound was cleaned, her strength returning, while Edith's coughs faded under the healer's care. Wulfric and Leofric sat by the fire, their faces easing, the grain sack a promise of full bellies. The woman, named Mildrith, told them of the village. No lord, no taxes, just people bound by work and trust. The rebellion hadn't reached them. The woman's fire stopped by the gray-haired man's band, villagers from a nearby settlement who'd refused her chains. Hilda, Mildrith said, had survived, her bow bloodied but unbroken, now guarding the wood's edge. Edric's guilt eased, his gratitude a quiet weight. Days passed, the grain shared, the village's fields welcoming their hands. Elfwind grew stronger, her knife now a tool for cutting herbs, her laughter a sound Edric had forgotten. Wulfric and Leofric ran with the village children, their thin frames filling out. While Edith's coughs were gone, her smile bright. Edric worked the land, his sickle traded for a plow, the West no longer a dream but a home. The woman's rebellion faded, her fire broken by those who chose peace over chains. The stranger's schemes, the Lord's wrath, old Godric's mark. They were ghosts, their answers lost in the ashes, but Edric didn't need them. Cynric's death, Jitha's scream, they lingered, but the village's warmth dulled their sting. One evening, Edric stood on the ridge, Elfwind beside him, their children's laughter drifting from below. "We made it," she said, her hand in his, her wound a faint scar. He nodded, his throat tight, the grain spark now a fire of their own. Family, home, hope. Leofric joined them, his eyes clear, his sister's loss a quiet strength. "Think she's still out there?" he asked, meaning the woman. Edric looked east, the woods dark but silent. "Maybe," he said, "but she don't own us." Elfwind's smile was fierce, her voice soft. "We own ourselves now." The takeaway was simple. Freedom wasn't won with blades or chance, but with hands that held tight, hearts that kept beating. The village wasn't perfect, work was hard, winters would bite, but it was theirs, built on trust, not fire. Edric's reflection was Wulfric's laugh, Edith's health, Elfwin's strength, Leofric's hope. The rebellion's mark, the Lord's chains, the stranger's schemes, they burned bright, but family outshone them all. As the sun set, Edric knew the story wasn't over. Life never was, but here, in this valley, they'd write their own, one day, one loaf, one laugh at a time. Show in sidebar.